Hey everyone, tonight we are stepping away from the neon lights and the hum of the modern world to travel back to a place where the dirt is as old as time and the silence is a physical weight on your chest. Imagine you are standing on a jagged, wind-whipped ridge in the Hindu Kush, the kind of place where the air is so thin it feels like you're breathing cold glass. Below you, a British supply column snakes through the valley floor, looking like a tiny scarlet centipede, vibrant, arrogant, and completely out of place against the dull ochre of the rocks. You are lying prone on a shelf of shale, your skin the exact color of the dust around you, holding a rifle that's longer than you are tall. You've been here for 6 hours, and you haven't moved a muscle, not even when a desert centipede crawled across your hand. You probably wouldn't survive this, honestly. Most people today can't sit through a 30-second ad without checking their phones, let alone wait 3 days for a single target to walk into a crosshair. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. So go ahead and post your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel while we all tucked away in our own corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the grit of the Waziristan soil beneath your fingernails, a constant reminder of the land that owns you as much as you own it. This isn't just a mountain. It's a labyrinth of vertical stone and hidden caves where the sun sets early and the shadows stay late. You are a product of this terrain, a shadow born of the frontier between the British Raj and the fierce independence of the tribal lands. The year is 1897, and the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and the metallic temps of approaching rain. Your lungs burn slightly with every breath, the high altitude a natural defense mechanism that keeps the soft-bodied men from the plains at a disadvantage. History remembers the Great Game as a series of chess moves played by kings and czars in velvet-lined rooms. But down here, the game is played with lead and sharp iron. You aren't interested in the maps drawn in London or St. Petersburg. You are interested in the man riding the bay horse 300 yards. Below the officer, whose gold braid glints just a little too brightly in the fading light, to the British, you are a sniper, a word still relatively fresh in their military lexicon, derived from the difficulty of shooting the small, erratic snipe bird. But to your people, you are something else, a practitioner of badal, the sacred obligation of revenge. The British called this area the Northwest Frontier, a theater of war that never really closes its curtains. It's a mainstream historical fact that this region was the most volatile border of the British Empire, requiring tens of thousands of troops just to keep the mountain passes even remotely functional. But while the history books focus on the grand sieges and the Victoria Cross winners, they often miss the individual who changed the math of the war. That's you. You are the reason a British lieutenant writes home to his mother about the invisible death that haunts the rocks. You adjust your weight, feeling the familiar bite of a stone against your ribs. Your weapon isn't a modern Lemaitre with a high-capacity magazine. No, you carry a Jezail, a handmade flintlock, or perhaps a captured Snyder Enfield. If you've been lucky with a barrel so long, it requires a forked rest to aim steadily. It's a quirky bit of fringe history that these primitive rifles often had a longer effective range than the standard issue. British muskets of the mid-19th century, thanks to their rifled bores and the sheer velocity generated by those elongated barrels, you know exactly how to use that extra 100 yards of reach. Historians still argue whether the resistance in these mountains was a unified religious jihad or merely a chaotic collection of independent tribal skirmishes. From your perspective, it's a bit of both, but mostly it's personal. You aren't just shooting at an empire, you're settling accounts. But you smarter than the hot-headed youths in the village who rush down the slopes with knives only to be mowed down by Maxim guns. You understand the power of a narrative. If an officer falls and you leave a token of a rival clan nearby, the British don't blame a rebellion, they blame a tribal feud. They see a local honor killing and look the other way, not realizing that the man you just removed was the only engineer capable of fixing the bridge at the mouth of the pass. The sun dips lower, casting long skeletal fingers across the valley. You watch the officer. He's laughing at something his sergeant said, oblivious to the fact that he is currently the most important person in your world. You don't feel hatred makes the hand shake. You feel a cold, professional curiosity. You wonder if he has a watch you can scavenge later, or if his boots would fit your younger brother. Life is pragmatic here. You check the wind by watching a stray tuft of goat hair caught on a thorn bush 20 feet away. It's a gentle westerly, barely enough to move the heavy lead ball you cast yourself over a dung fire last night. You remember your father telling you that a Pashtun is never at peace except when he is at war. It sounds poetic, but in reality, it's just exhausting. Your life is a series of calculations. Calories burned versus calories gained, cartridges spent versus targets neutralized. You've spent the last 3 days tracking this specific unit. Moving through the nullista dry creek beds that provide natural trenches, you know these paths, like the veins on the back of your hand. The British try to map them, but the mountains shift with every spring flood, rendering their paper charts useless within a season. As you settle the butt of the rifle into your shoulder, the wooden blade with bits of mother of pearl and brass wire feels warm against your cheek. It's a beautiful tool for a grim trade. You take a slow breath, letting half of it out, feeling your heart rate drop. This is the moment where time stretches. The sound of the wind dies down, the distant jingle of harness brass fades, and there is only the sight picture. You aren't just a man with a gun. You are a ghost in the machinery of an empire. You recall a fringe tidbit you heard from a traveler in the bazaar, that some British officers started wearing chainmail vests under their tunics to protect against the long-range sting of the Jazeel. You aim for the neck, chainmail won't help them there. You aren't just killing a man, you're sending a message to every soldier in that column that the rocks themselves are hostile. And the best part? When the investigation happens, the blood feud cover you've carefully cultivated will ensure the British turn their anger toward your neighbor, the one who stole your uncle's water rights 3 years ago. 2 birds, 1 lead ball. The trigger pull is heavy, a deliberate act of will. You feel the flint strike, the spark hiss in the pan, and then the world disappears in a cloud of acrid white smoke. You don't wait to see him fall. You already know the trajectory. You're already rolling backward, tucking your rifle under your arm, and disappearing into a crevice before the sound of the report even reaches the valley floor. By the time the British soldiers are shouting and pointing their rifles at the empty crags, you are 100 yards away, moving through a tunnel of stone that only a mountain goat should know. The smoke from your shot lingers for only a second before the mountain breeze shreds it into nothingness. But the EcoSto's stubborn, bouncing ghosts of sound will keep the British soldiers jumping at shadows for the next 20 minutes. You are already moving, staying low to the ground, your body instinctually finding the path of least resistance through the jagged scree. You aren't running. Running makes you lose your footing, and a twisted ankle in these heights is a death sentence. Instead, you move with a fluid, predatory grace. A technique passed down through generations of mountain hunters who knew that the only way to survive the high country was to become a part of it. You are practicing the ultimate expression of Pashtunwali, the ancient ethical code that dictates every facet of your existence. To an outsider, Pashtunwali might seem like a simple list of rules, but to you, it is the very air you breathe. It is a complex, three-dimensional web of social obligations that makes the British legal system look like a child-esque game of hopscotch. At its heart are the pillars of Nanawati Asylum, Melmastia Hospitality, and the one that currently guides your trigger finger, badal justice or revenge. It is a mainstream historical fact that the British military struggled immensely to understand the shifting loyalties of the frontier tribes, because they failed to grasp that a Pashtun's first loyalty is not to a flag or a king, but to this code. If someone insults your family, you don't call a lawyer. You wait years if you have to, because in these mountains, revenge is a dish that doesn't just stay cold, it freezes solid. But your genius, the reason you are still alive, while other sharpshooters have been caught, and strung up his how you VA weaponized this code. You understand that the British see the frontier as a place of mindless, savage violence. They expect the tribes to be constantly at each other's throats. So, you give them exactly what they expect. By framing your strategic assassinations as local honor killings, you play into their colonial biases. You make yourself invisible by hiding in plain sight behind a curtain of simulated chaos. Historians still argue whether the legendary invisible snipers of the 1890s were working under a central command or if they were truly independent actors. But, as you tuck yourself into a narrow overhang to let a British patrol scramble past below, you know the truth. You are a shadow within a shadow. You remember the time your cousin tried to explain modern law to you after visiting Peshawar, He talked about courthouses and judges in powdered wigs. You had laughed, leaning against the mud brick wall of your family's kala, or fortified farmhouse. Here, the only judge is the jirga, the council of elders, and the only evidence that matters is a man's word and the length of his memory. You once heard a quirky fringe tidbit that a British officer tried to tame a local chieftain by gifting him a grandfather clock, only for the chief to use the heavy pendulum as a head-crushing weapon during a dispute over a stolen goat. It's a bit of a dark joke, but it illustrates the point. You cannot impose civilized time on a land that operates on the clock of the blood feud. As you navigate a narrow chimney of rock, the texture of the sandstone grating against your wool vest, you think about the man you just killed. He wasn't just a random soldier. He was the primary surveyor for the new telegraph line. By removing him, you haven't just taken a life, you've delayed the British Empire's ability to communicate by weeks. But the note you left tucked under a cairn of stones half a mile away suggests he was killed by a member of the Afridi tribe over a perceived slight involving a local woman. It's a lie, of course, but it's a lie that fits perfectly into the British narrative of tribal volatility. You probably wouldn't survive the mental gymnastics required to keep all these lies straight. But for you, it's just survival. The sun is beginning to bake the rocks now, creating shimmering heat distortion that makes the valley floor look like it's underwater. You find a spot to rest a small natural cup in the cliffside, where the wind doesn't reach. You pull a piece of hard, sun-dried yogurt from your pouch and let it soften in your mouth. This is the unglamorous part of the sniper's life: the waiting, the thirst, and the silence. You think about the civilized world the British keep talking about bringing to the mountains. They want to build roads so they can move their cannons, and telegraphs so they can move their orders. They want to turn your vertical world into a flat map they can tuck into a drawer. But the code of Pashtunwali is horizontal. It connects you to your neighbor, your enemy, and your ancestors in a way that a road never could. You recall a story about a British colonel who was so impressed by the hospitality of a local tribesman that he forgot the man was technically his enemy till the colonel left the man's house and was promptly shot at from the next ridge. That's the beauty of it. The code allows for hospitality and war to exist in the same hour. You could share tea with a man at noon and be obligated to hunt him at sunset if the blood debt demands it. It's a system of balance, a brutal but effective way of managing resources and honor in a land where both are in short supply. You check your rifle, ensuring no grit has entered the delicate mechanism of the flintlock. The wood is worn smooth in the places where your hands grip it most often. This weapon is an extension of your body, just as the code is an extension of your soul. You've seen young men try to use the British Martini Henry rifles they've scavenged, but those rifles require a steady supply of factory-made cartridges. Your Jazeel, you can make the powder in a cave and cast the balls from a melted-down tea tray if you have to. You are self-sufficient, a ghost that needs nothing from the world below. As the afternoon shadows begin to stretch, you prepare to move again. The British will be setting up their camp for the night, forming a defensive perimeter of Sunger's small stone breastworks. They think they are safe behind their walls, but you know that walls are just targets that don't move. You've already identified the next person on your list, a sergeant who is known for his skill with the heliograph, the sun mirror used for signaling. If he disappears tonight, the British column will be blind and mute when they reach the next pass. And tomorrow, a different tribe will be blamed. Because ULL make sure to use a bullet cast from a specific type of lead found only in the southern hills. You are the invisible hand of the mountains, balancing the scales of history one shot at a time. You shift your weight on the jagged shelf of rock, the movement so slow and deliberate that a lizard basking 3 feet away doesn't even blink. Your fingers trail over the long, curved stock of your Jezzel, a weapon that looks more like a piece of dark, twisted driftwood than a tool of modern precision. To a British regular, this rifle is a primitive relic, a long, heavy, clumsy thing, as one officer wrote in his journal, but you know better. The Jazeel is the ultimate mountain predator's tool. It is a mainstream historical fact that during the 19th century Anglo-Afghan wars, these handmade rifles consistently outranged the British Brown Bess muskets and even gave the later Enfield rifles a run for their money. While the British were trained to fire in volleys at targets they could barely see, you were trained to treat every single lead ball like a precious family heirloom. The barrel of your Jozile is nearly 6 feet long, made of heavy iron that you've wrapped in thin strips of leather to dampen the vibration and keep the sun from glinting off the metal. It's an awkward beast to carry through the narrow chimneys of the Hindu Kush, but that length is exactly what gives you your edge. The long barrel allows for a more complete combustion of the black powder, propelling the heavy lead ball with a muzzle velocity that catches the British by surprise every time. You probably wouldn't. T survived the recoil of this thing if you didn't know how to brace it properly against the rock, or your custom-made forked rest. It kicks like a mule with a grudge. But the result is a flat trajectory that lets you pick off a water bucket handle from a distance that makes the British think they were being struck by lightning from a clear sky. One quirky fringe tidbit about these rifles is that the deep, dramatic curve of the stock isn't just for aesthetics. It's designed so you can tuck the butt of the gun under your armpit or high against your shoulder while firing from the back of a moving camel or horse. It gives you a strange, high-cheek weld that would make a modern marksman cringe. But for you, it's as natural as pointing a finger. Your particular Jazile is a work of art and a record of your life. Inlaid into the dark walnut are small circular pieces of Mudharafo, each representing a successful contract or a settled debt. There are more circles on this stock than there are fingers on your hands. You've even scavenged a brass trigger guard from a downed British officer's pistol, a little trophy that reminds you of the vulnerability of superior technology. Historians still argue whether the legendary accuracy of the Jazile Keitha mountain snipers was due to the rifles themselves or the uncanny eyesight and patience of the men who fired them. You know, it's a marriage of both. You don't have a telescopic sight. You have a notched iron leaf and a lifetime of learning how to read the air. You look at the heat haze shimmering above the valley floor. You know that the air in the shade of the cliffs is denser than the air in the sun-drenched center, and that your bullet will lift as it crosses the boundary between them. You've spent years practicing with this specific barrel, learning its quirks, its favors, and the way it hums when the wind catches the muzzle. It isn't a mass-produced item from a factory in Birmingham. It was forged in a mountain hut by a man who knew your grandfather. You reach into your leather pouch and pull out a lead ball. It's not perfectly spherically you cast it yourself in a soapstone mold, but you've polished it with a bit of sheep fat to ensure it grips the rifling. The rifling in a Jazile is often shallow and hand-cut, but it's enough to give the ball that essential spin. You'll remember hearing a story from a trader about how the British were experimenting with mini-balls, those conical bullets that expand to fit the grooves of the barrel. You find it amusing. Why bother with such complicated shapes when a heavy round ball of lead traveling fast enough can shatter a man's shoulder or drop a horse in its tracks? Your equipment is simple, and simplicity is the brother of reliability. If your flint breaks, you find another piece of quartz on the ground. If your spring snaps, the village blacksmith can fix it with a bit of tempered scrap iron. The British soldiers below are currently cleaning their rifles, those shiny short-barreled carbines they're so proud of. They spend hours polishing the brass and oiling the wood, treating them like ceremonial objects. To you, your Jazile is a limb. It's covered in the same dust as your clothes. It's been dropped, scraped, and bled on. You've even used the long barrel as a walking stick when navigating a particularly steep scree slope. It doesn't need to be pretty. It only needs to be true. You'll remember that crocodile dung sunscreen mentioned by travelers. Well, you use something similar, a mixture of soot and animal fat smeared on the barrel to kill any reflection. It's a low-tech solution for high-stakes problem. You settle back into your sangar, the small, semicircular wall of stones you've built to break up your silhouette. You rest the long barrel on the forked wooden stick, the bipod of the mountains. The weight of the iron is immense, but once it's set, it's as steady as the mountain itself. You look through the sights, not at a target yet, but just to check the light. The sun is hitting the valley at a 45-degree angle. This is the golden hour for the British, but for you, it's the hour of the long shadow. The sights align perfectly. You can see a beetle crawling on a rock 200 yards away. You think about the history of this weapon. It's a descendant of the Persian matchlock, evolved over centuries to meet the specific demands of the frontier. It's a weapon of the underdog, designed to bridge the gap between a tribal warrior and a global superpower. Every time you pull the trigger, you are asserting that a man with a handmade tool can stop an empire in its tracks. You aren't just a sniper, you are a technician of resistance. You know that the British have started calling this the Jazile Wala-S War in their private letters? A grudging respect for the weapon that consistently finds the gaps in their defenses. As you wait, you start the slow process of loading. You pour a measured horn of black powder down the long throat of the barrel. You can smell the sulfur and saltpeter, a sharp, pungent scent that is the perfume of the frontier. You wrap the lead ball in a small patch of greased linen and ram it home with a hickory rod. The thud of the ball seating against the powder is a satisfying, solid sound. Then you prime the pan with a pinch of finer powder. You close the frizzen with a soft click. The weapon is now a loaded spring, a dormant volcano waiting for your command. You won't fire yet. You wait for the officer, who looks like he's in charge of the water rations. In this dry heat, thirst is a better killer than lead, and you are the one who decides who gets to drink. The British officers call this region unstable, a polite word for a place where every rock has eyes and every canyon has a memory. To them, the violence is a messy, tangled knot of irrationality, but to you, the chaos of the tribal blood feud is a finely tuned instrument. You understand that in the eyes of the British military administration, a dead soldier is a tragedy, but a dead soldier killed by tribal infighting is just a Tuesday. It is a mainstream historical fact that the British often tried to leverage local rivalries to their advantage, employing a divide-and-conquer strategy that frequently backfired because they did realize the locals were playing the exact same game, often much better. You use this to your advantage every single day. When you take a shot from the high ridges, you aren't just aiming for a heart or a head, you are aiming for a specific political outcome. If you kill a British scout and leave a spent cartridge casing from a rifle known to be used by the Moman tribe, the British will launch a punitive expedition against the Momand, while the Redcoats are busy burning the Momand crops and blowing up their towers. You and your kinsmen are free to move supplies through the now unguarded southern passes. It is a cynical, brilliant shell game. You probably wouldn't survive the guilt if you viewed these people as your brothers. But in the world of the blood feud, neighbor is often just another word for future target. There is a quirky fringe tidbit that some Pashtun snipers would actually go so far as to steal specific, identifiable daggers or pieces of clothing from one rival clan just to drop them at the scene of an assassination against the British. You've done it yourself. You once spent 3 days tracking a minor chieftain from a rival valley just to steal his distinctive turquoise-inlaid tobacco pouch. 2 days later, after you've put a lead ball through the chest of a British transport officer, you left that pouch resting on a prominent rock near the body. The British, convinced they had found the culprit, spent the next month embroiled in a legal and military standoff with that chieftain, leaving you perfectly obscured by the dust of their dispute. Historians still argue whether this level of tactical deception was widespread or merely the work of a few exceptional ghost operators. From where you sit, the answer is simple. The ones who didn't use the feuds as cover are the ones whose names are carved into village headstones. Survival here requires more than marksmanship. It requires a deep sociological understanding of your enemy's prejudices. The British believe the tribes are primitive and reactive. By acting with extreme calculation while wearing the mask of a reactive tribesman, you create a blind spot the size of a mountain range. They see a brawling mess of savages. You see a chessboard where you painted all the pieces the same color to confuse the player. You recall a moment from last winter, huddled in a cave with your younger brother, explaining why you weren't going to join the massed charge against the British camp at Chikara. A man who shouts his name before he strikes is a man who wants to be remembered, you told him. But a man who strikes in silence is a man who wants to live. Your brother had looked at your Jezzail, then at the ancestral sword he was sharpening, and hadn't understood. He died 3 weeks later in a hail of Maxim gun fiera, brave, loud, and utterly useless death. He settled his debt not by charging the same guns, but by picking off the British quartermaster responsible for the ammunition supply. Now, the British think the quartermaster was killed because he refused to pay a local protection tax. The feud continues, the cover holds, and you remain a shadow. The brilliance of the blood feud cover is that it is self-sustaining. Every time the British retaliate against the wrong village, they create a new, genuine grievance. This fuels more local violence, which creates more noise for you to hide in. It's a feedback loop of beautiful, terrifying efficiency. You've watched the British district commissioners try to mediate these disputes in their tented courts. They sit there with their ledgers and their interpreters trying to trace the lineage of a stolen bull or a diverted stream, completely unaware that the theft was staged by you to provoke a skirmish that would distract the guards at the telegraph station. You aren't just a sniper. You are a director of a grand, violent theater. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from the traveler's tales. It's a joke among your people, but the British actually believed some of the more outlandish native survival myths. You once let a captured sepoy overhear a rumor that the snipers in the hills were actually spirits who could only be seen if you wore your tunic inside out. For the next week, you watched through your sights as an entire platoon of confused soldiers marched with their seams showing. It didn't make them any harder to hit, but it did wonders for your morale and further convinced the British that they were dealing with a superstitious, irrational foe. As the sun reaches its zenith, the heat becomes a physical presence. Pressing down on your shoulders, you see a group of soldiers gathered around a water mule. Among them is a man wearing the distinctive insignia of the Royal Engineers. He is the one who is mapping the new road that will bring the heavy cannons. If he dies, the road stops. But you can't just shoot him and run. You wait until a local shepherd, a man known for his hot temper and his long-standing dispute with the British over grazing rights, passes by on the lower trail. You time the shot perfectly. The crack of the Jezile is swallowed by the narrow canyon walls, echoing so many times that the soldiers can't tell which ridge it came from. The engineer falls. The shepherd, panicked by the sudden gunfire and the sight of a dead Ferengi, drops his staff and bolts. To the British soldiers, it looks like the shepherd fired a hidden pistol and fled. By tomorrow, the shepherd's village will be under investigation, and you will be miles away, scouting the next location. You feel no malice toward the shepherd. He is simply a piece on the board. In the mountains, honor is everything, but survival is the prerequisite for honor. You adjust your position, the warm stones shifting under your belly, and begin the long, slow crawl away from the scene of the crime. The British Raj is a behemoth, a global titan that thinks in terms of continents and centuries, but as you look down from your rocky perch, you see it for what it truly is in these mountains, a giant bleeding from 1,000 tiny cuts. It is a mainstream historical fact that the northwest frontier was the griddle of the British Indian Army, a perpetual training ground where the cost of maintaining order often far outweighed the strategic value of the land itself. You watch the redcoats moving in their rigid formations, their bright uniforms serving as a defiant, incredibly foolish shout against the muted browns of the earth. They represent an empire that spans from the rainy docks of London to the humid jungles of Burma. Yet here, in this specific 3-mile stretch of the Khyber region, their power is limited to the distance their eyes can see and their bullets can travel. You see the strain in the way the pack mules stumble, and the way the younger soldiers constantly glance upward, their necks stiff from the fear of the mountain sting. The Raj is overstretched. For every battalion sent to the frontier, there are fewer men to hold the volatile streets of Calcutta or the rebellious plains of the Punjab. You are a student of this exhaustion. You've noticed that the quality of the British boots has declined lately. The leather is thinner, the stitching hurried, suggesting that the industrial heart of the empire is struggling to keep up with the demands of its endless borders. You probably wouldn't survive the bureaucratic nightmare of managing such a mess, but you are more than happy to contribute to its collapse. There is a quirky fringe tidbit that during this era, the British were so desperate to maintain the appearance of total control that they would sometimes stage elaborate victory parades in empty valleys, playing brass instruments and marching in circles, just to impress the local scouts they knew were watching from the cliffs. You've sat through these performances, chewing on a bitter piece of dried wild almond, unimpressed by the music, but very interested in the shiny brass instruments. To you, those trumpets aren't symbols of majesty. They are excellent sources of scrap metal for casting future bullet molds. The empire thinks it is projecting strength, but in reality, it is merely advertising its most expensive targets. Historians still argue whether the British presence in the frontier was a genuine attempt at stabilization or a cynical forward policy designed to create a buffer against Russian influence. You've heard the rumors of the great game from the traders in the caravanserais, whispers of Russian spies, in fur hats carrying gold coins and secret maps. To you, the British and the Russians are just two different flavors of the same intrusive spirit. If a Russian officer showed up with a surveyor's chain, you'd put a lead ball through him just as quickly as you would a Briton. The mountains don't belong to the player who moves the pieces. They belong to the mountain. You observe a young subaltern at the rear of the column, struggling with a heavy leather dispatch case. He looks barely old enough to shave, his face sun-scorched to a painful, peeling red. He represents the thin red line, the backbone of an imperial administration that relies on the prestige of the white man to keep millions in check. But prestige is a fragile thing. It's a balloon that stays inflated only as long as no one pricks it. Every time you take a shot and disappear, you are letting out a little bit of that air. When a British officer is killed by a ghost who is never seen and never caught, the myth of British invincibility takes a hit that no amount of parade music can fix. The logistics of the Raj in this terrain are a nightmare of their own making. They insist on bringing their comforts with them: portable bathtubs, crates of gin, heavy canvas tents, and folding chairs. You've seen entire baggage trains slowed to a crawl because a colonel's favorite writing desk fell off a camel. You travel with a wool blanket, a bag of parched grain, and your rifle. Their complexity is their weakness. You once saw a British unit get pinned down for 3 days because they ran out of the specific oil needed for their new temperamental rifles. You, meanwhile, use the fat from a mountain goat to keep your Jazil's lock moving smoothly. It's a lesson in the lethality of simplicity versus the burden of civilization. You remember a story about a British general who claimed he could civilize the frontier by building a school in every village. He didn't realize that in these mountains, a school is just a place where you learn who your enemies are and how to count the days until the next harvest. The Raj tries to impose a Pax Britannica, a piece of the grave, but the soil here doesn't take to foreign seeds. You watch the columns stop for a breather, the soldiers collapsing in the meager shade of their wagons. They are exhausted, not just by the climb, but by the sheer scale of the hostility around them. Even the wind here feels like it's trying to push them back toward the sea. As you prepare to follow them into the next valley, you notice a British sergeant major screaming orders, trying to whip the tired men back into a disciplined line. He is the glue holding this tiny fragment of the empire together. If he dies, the discipline wavers. If the discipline wavers, the men start to look at the ridges and see 1,000 snipers instead of just one. You decide to spare the subaltern with the red face. He's too green to be a real threat, but the sergeant major, he understands the terrain. He knows how to set up a perimeter. He is the real representative of the Raj's military power. You shift your Jazil, the long barrel sliding over a patch of moss. You aren't just a combatant. You are a demographic auditor. You are checking the empire's books and finding them in the red. The Raj is a long way from home, and every mile they march into the heart of the Hindu Kush is a mile they might not march back. You think back to that crocodile dung joke. The British might have laughed at it, but they read the ones sweating in wool tunics in 100-degree heat while you sit in the cool breath of a cave. You take a slow, steady breath, aligning the iron sights on the brass buckle of the sergeant major's belt. The Raj is a giant, yes, but even giants have a center of gravity, and you are about to nudge it. The Khyber Pass is not just a geographical gap in the limestone and shale. It is a throat that has swallowed armies since the time of Alexander. As you wedge yourself into a narrow islet of rock high above the narrowest point of the pass, you feel the weight of that history pressing against your back. Below you, the sheer walls of the pass rise hundreds of feet, creating a natural kill zone where the wind howls with a mournful, predatory sound. It is a mainstream historical fact that the Khyber was the most strategic bottleneck in the British Empire's defense of India. A place where a handful of men with rifles could and often did thwart the movement of thousands. From your vantage point, the mighty British column looks like a slow-moving river of red and steel, constrained by the very earth they seek to conquer. Being a shadow in the Khyber requires a level of patience that would drive a city dweller to madness. You aren't just sitting, you are becoming part of the geology. You've learned to slow your breathing so that your chest doesn't heave against the stone, a technique that keeps your silhouette as static as the boulders around you. You probably wouldn't survive the mental strain of this isolation if you didn't have a mission that burned hotter than the midday sun. The British have fortified certain sections of the pass with Ali Masjid, a fortress that sits like a brooding gargoyle over the road, but they cannot fortify every inch of the heights. They control the road, but you control the air above it. One quirky fringe tidbit about the Khyber snipers is that some used to carry small, polished shards of obsidian to peek around corners without exposing their heads. You have a small piece of a broken British mirror for the same purpose, a little fragment of their own vanity used against them. You use it now to glance down the winding path behind you, ensuring no Khyber rifles the local levies hired by the British are attempting to outflank your position. These levies are dangerous. They know the mountains as well as you do, and they are paid in British silver to hunt their own brothers. But they are also superstitious. They won't enter the Valley of the Shadow after the sun hits a certain angle, believing it to be haunted by the jinn. You use these superstitions like extra layers of armor. Historians still argue whether the various tribes of the Khyber, the Ifritas, the Shinwaris, and the Orak-Saskud ever have truly united to expel the British for good. You know the answer is a complicated no. The blood feuds you use as cover are real, and they run deep. You've seen families fight for 3 generations over a single diverted irrigation ditch. But in the silence of the pass, you represent a different kind of unity, the unity of the predator. You don't need a grand alliance to be effective. You just need the British to be afraid. When they enter the Khyber, their officers order the men to stop singing and to keep their bayonets fixed. The silence of the pass is contagious. It forces them to listen for the sound of your heartbeat, even though they'll never hear it. You watch as a British signalman attempts to set up a heligraph on a lower plateau. The sun is perfect for it. The bright flashes of light can carry messages for miles, leapfrogging from ridge to ridge. This is the magic of the British, their ability to speak across mountains without shouting. But the magic is fragile. You adjust the long barrel of your Jazeel. The leather wrappings cool against your skin. If you break that mirror, the column loses its voice. But if you kill the signalman, the column loses its morale. You decide on a third option. You wait for the moment he is mid-transmission, and you skip a lead ball off the rocks just above his head. The resulting shower of stone splinters ruins the equipment and sends the man diving for cover. But it leaves him alive to tell the tale of the ghost of the Khyber, who can hit a button from half a mile away. The geography of the Khyber is a map of echoes. When you finally decide to fire a true shot, you have to account for the way the sound will bounce. A single report can sound like 5 different shooters from 5 different directions. This acoustic camouflage is your best friend. You remember a fringe detail about a British captain who tried to use Ertrumpet's primitive listening devices too. Triangulate the position of snipers in the pass. You find the image hilarious. A man in a pith helmet holding a giant metal cone to his ear while you sit directly above him, chewing on a piece of dried meat. The mountains don't give up their secrets to gadgets. They only speak to those who have lived in their laps since birth. The air in the pass begins to cool as the shadows of the western walls stretch across the road. This is the most dangerous time for the British. They want to reach the next sangar or fortified camp before dark, so they begin to hurry. Hurrying leads to mistakes. A pack mule loses its footing and tumbles down a ravine, taking 2 crates of ammunition with it. The soldiers pause, debating whether to retrieve it. You watch them through your sights, the brass bead of your Jazeel centered on the officer's chest. This is the shadows in the Khyber Pass phase of your campaign. You aren't just killing, you are delaying. Every minute they spend in the pass is a minute they are exposed. And every minute they are exposed, their confidence erodes like the limestone under a spring flood. You recall the mainstream fact that the British eventually had to pay subsidies, essentially protection money, to the tribes just to keep the Khyber Pass open for trade. It was a humiliation they disguised as administrative fees. You are the reason those fees stay high. By maintaining a constant low-level threat, you ensure that the British never feel like they truly own the ground they walk on. You are a reminder that the Raj is a guest in these mountains, and a guest who has overstayed his welcome. As the last of the sunlight vanishes from the floor of the pass, leaving it in a deep, purple gloom, you prepare to relocate. You don't leave by the paths. You climb straight up the chimney of the cliff, your fingers finding holds that have been worn smooth by centuries of mountain goats and men just like you. The British will spend the night in their camps, huddled around small fires, staring up at the dark ridges. They will hear the wind whistling through the rocks and think it's a human voice. They will see the stars and wonder if one of them is the glint of a rifle barrel. You, meanwhile, will be sleeping in a cave 2 miles away, your Jazeel wrapped in a dry cloth, your belly full of parched corn. You are the master of the Khyber, not because you have a fort, but because you have the patience of the stone itself. The arithmetic of the frontier is brutal and unforgiving. 1 man, 1 rifle, 1 ounce of lead, and a single moment of perfect stillness can halt the momentum of a 1,000-man regiment. You are currently balanced on a ledge so narrow that your heels hang over a drop that would turn a man into a memory before he hit the bottom. Down below, The British column is transitioning from the open valley into a jagged throat of rock, a transition that creates a natural accordion effect where the men bunch up and lose their rhythm. This is the moment you've been waiting for. This is the first strike of your campaign, the shot that will be talked about in the officers' messes from Peshawar to London, though they will never know the name of the man who pulled the trigger. You probably wouldn't survive the tension of this moment if your heart were as cold as the mountain spring. Your target isn't the lead scout or the obvious commander. It is the man carrying the survey transit, the eyes of the expedition. Without him, the British are just powerful blind men wandering into a trap. It is a mainstream historical fact that the British military of the late 19th century relied heavily on specialized pioneers and surveyors to map the routes for their heavy artillery. By removing the specialist, you don't just kill a soldier, you kill a plan. You watch the surveyor through your iron sights, seeing the way he pauses to wipe sweat from his brow, a mundane human gesture that you are about to end forever. One quirky fringe tidbit about the sharpshooters of the Waziristan ridges is that they would often coat their bullets in a thin layer of wax mixed with pulverized charcoal. The charcoal acted as a primitive lubricant, while the dark color ensured that the bullet did reflect the sun as it sat in the muzzle, preventing a lens flare that might give away a position. You've treated your heavy lead ball with this mixture, and as you settle the trigger, you feel the familiar heavy resistance of the hand-forged mechanism. Historians still argue whether these early mountain campaigns were characterized by chaotic skirmishes or highly coordinated guerrilla hits. From your perspective, it feels like a dark science. You aren't just firing, you're solving a physical equation involving gravity, windage, and the psychological impact of a sudden, unexplained death. The recoil of the Jazil hits your shoulder like the kick of a donkey, and for a split second, the world is obscured by a rolling curtain of sulfurous smoke. You don't need to see the result to know it was a hit. You can feel the truth of the shot in the way the rifle stayed steady through the ignition. As the smoke clears, you see the surveyor crumple, his expensive brass equipment clattering onto the stones. The reaction below is instantaneous and predictable. A cacophony of whistles, shouted orders, and the frantic clack-clack of bolt-action rifles being cycled. They are firing at the ridge, but they are firing at where they think you are, which is exactly where you were 5 seconds ago. You are already rolling into a crevice, the long barrel of your rifle tucked close to your body. This first strike starts a decade of confusion because of how you've staged the aftermath. You didn't just fire from anywhere. You fired from a position that naturally funnels the sound of the report toward the territory of the Zakakel tribe, a group already in a heated land dispute with the British. By the time the British scouts scramble up the cliffs, they won't find you. They find a few discarded shell casings from a rifle type commonly used by the Zakakel casings you've been collecting for months for exactly this purpose. You've just initiated a blood feud between an empire and a tribe, and you did it with the cost of a single lead ball. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen joke from earlier? The British are so busy looking for the absurd and the primitive that they miss the calculated and the sophisticated. They think you are a wild tribesman acting on impulse. They don't realize you have a mental ledger of every hit, every diversion, and every fake clue you've planted. The arithmetic of 1 is powerful because it's a variable the British can't account for. They can fight an army, they can't fight a ghost that leaves another man's footprints. You watch from a secondary, higher position as the British commander looks at the body of his surveyor. Then at the hills of the Zakakel, his face hardening into a mask of redirected rage. The first strike is a psychological masterclass. By picking off the most civilian-looking member of the military party, you VA signaled that no one is safe and that the rules of engagement are whatever you decide they are. You hear the distant rhythmic thud-thud of a British mountain gunner to 5-inch RM, firing blindly into the rocks of the neighboring ridge. They are wasting expensive ammunition on shadows and shale. You smile, a dry, humorless expression. Every shell they fire into the wrong mountain is a shell. They woe and have when they finally reach the true heart of the resistance. You are the architect of their exhaustion. As the sun begins to dip, casting the valley into a bruised purple light, the British begin the grim task of carrying their dead. They move slower now, their formation tighter, their eyes darting to every outcrop. You've successfully injected the poison of paranoia into their ranks. They will spend the night whispering about the ghost of the pass. And tomorrow, when a Zakakel shepherd happens to cross their path, The British will likely open fire first and ask questions later. And so, the cycle of the blood feud will be reinforced by the very people who claim to be here to end it. You pull your wool shawl tighter against the rising mountain chill, the smell of burnt powder still clinging to your beard, and begin the long walk to your next overwatch. The British have their drill manuals and their parade grounds, but you have the ghost crawler method of movement, so agonizingly slow it borders on a meditative trance. To the soldiers below, a pile of shale is just a pile of shale, but to you, it is a minefield of sound. A single pebble sliding down a slope can sound like a thunderclap in the thin mountain air, and a snapping twig is a flare that gives away your position to every sentry within a mile. You are currently navigating a 300-yard stretch of open ground to reach a better vantage point, and it will take you 4 hours. This is the art of the crawl, staying so close to the earth that you can feel the mountain's heartbeat against your own. It is a mainstream historical fact that the scouting and sniping schools later established by the British Army were born out of the humiliating lessons they learned from the tribes of the Northwest frontier. They realized that their traditional skirmishing was too loud and too upright. You, however, move like a lizard. You don't use your knees or elbows, which can create distinct unnatural thuds. Instead, you use the sides of your feet and your forearms, distributing your weight so evenly that you don't even disturb the dust. You probably wouldn't. Survive the sheer physical exhaustion of this if your muscles hadn't been tempered by a lifetime of climbing these peaks. Every inch is a battle against the urge to hurry. One quirky fringe tidbit about the ghost crawl is that some snipers would carry a small bag of local sand and dust to sprinkle over their tracks as they moved, effectively erasing their path in real time. You take it a step further, you've sewn patches of rough gray gouache onto the contact points of your clothing. Not only does this muffle the sound of your movement against the stone, but it also mimics the texture of the lichen-covered rocks. If a British sentry scans the ridge with his binoculars, his eyes will slide right over you. You aren't just hiding, you are becoming an optical illusion. You've even learned to time your most significant movements with the natural rhythms of the mountain, the gust of a wind, the cry of a hawk, or the distant braying of a British pack mule. Historians still argue whether the legendary invisible movements of the Pashtun warriors were a result of superior local knowledge or a specific taught discipline. You know, it's a mixture of both, seasoned with a healthy dose of survival instinct. You remember seeing a British expert in a Peshawar market trying to demonstrate a stealthy approach to his recruits. He looked like a dancing bear compared to the silence of a mountain leopard. The British think of movement as a way to get from point A to point B. You think of movement as a vulnerability that must be minimized. While you crawl, your jazeel is tied to your side with soft leather thongs, its long barrel protected by a cloth wrap so it doesn't clink against the stones. The physical toll of the ghost crawl is immense. Your core muscles are screaming, and the grit has worked its way into your pores, turning your sweat into a stinging paste. But you find a strange, detached peace in the effort. You are observing the world from the perspective of the insects. You see the intricate patterns in the sandstone and the way the shadows of the clouds race across the valley floor. From this low angle, the British camp looks like a fragile toy set, easily broken. You watch a sentry yawn, his rifle leaning carelessly against a rock. He thinks he is safe because he is looking at the mountain, but he isn't looking into it. He doesn't see the patch of rock that has moved 6 feet closer since he last checked. You'll recall a fringe detail from a traveler who spoke of the Thuggee cults in the South and their silent killings. You find their methods messy and theatrical. There is no need for silk, nooses, or secret societies when you have the silence of the Hindu Kush. Your silence is your weapon. By the time you reach your final position, a hollowed-out nest behind a cluster of boulders, you are so covered in the earth that you look like a statue carved from the mountain itself. You don't immediately reach for your rifle. You wait. You let your heart rate settle. You let your body heat dissipate. So you do create a shimmering heat mirage that could be spotted against the cool morning air. The ghost crawl is also a psychological tool. When the British find the remains of a campfire or a spent cartridge in a place they thought was inaccessible, the mystery of how you got there eats at them. It creates the impression that you can walk through walls or fly over ridges. You once spent an entire night crawling into the very center of a British picket line just to leave a specific tribal dagger stuck in the ground next to the commander's tent. You didn't kill anyone that night. The terror of knowing you could have was far more effective. It's about more than just the shot. It's about the total domination of the environment. As the first light of dawn begins to gray the eastern sky, you finally unwrap your jazeel. You are perfectly positioned, the sun will rise behind you, putting the British in the glare and keeping you in the deep shadow of the peak. You've covered 300 yards of impossible terrain without displacing a single stone. You take a sip of water from your leather skin, the liquid tasting of goat and iron, and prepare for the day's work. The British are waking up, shivering in the morning mist, unaware that the mountain has moved closer to them in the night. You are the ghost in their periphery, the silence that precedes the storm. You are now a master of the 19th century invisibility cloak, though it's not made of magic. It's made of mud, goat hair, and a deep understanding of light and shadow. While the British soldiers are being issued khaki, a word derived from the Persian kak, meaning dust, they are still essentially wearing flat, solid blocks of color. Even their revolutionary tan uniforms are too uniform. To disappear in the jagged, mottled landscape of the frontier, you've realized that you must break up your human outline until you look like a collection of random debris. You look down at your sleeves, which you've smeared with a mixture of wet clay and crushed lichen. When it dries, it doesn't just match the color of the rocks, it matches the texture. It is a mainstream historical fact that the British discovery of khaki during the Indian Mutiny and subsequent frontier wars was a turning point in military history, marking the end of the bright red era. But while the British were patting themselves on the back for their new tan tunics, you were already light years ahead. You probably wouldn't survive a minute in a modern forest with this kit. But here, among the shale and sandstone, you are a master of the low-tech ghillie suit. You've woven long strands of unwashed wool and rough hemp into your shawl, creating a shaggy, uneven surface that mimics the scrubby bushes clinging to the cliffs. When you lie still, the wind catches these fibers, moving them in the same rhythm as the surrounding flora. One quirky fringe tidbit about mountain camouflage is the use of eye black made from charred walnuts. You don't just put it under your eyes to reduce glare. You map out the hollows of your cheeks and the bridge of your nose with dark streaks to flatten your facial features. A human face is a series of predictable highlights and shadows that the brain recognizes instantly. By reversing those shadows, darkening the parts the sun hits, and leaving the deep crevices, naturally you become a faceless extension of the mountain. You've even gone as far as to wrap your jazzle in strips of dull, tattered cloth of varying shades, ensuring that the long, straight line of the barrel is broken into a series of jagged, natural segments. Historians still argue whether the extreme effectiveness of tribal snipers was due to their camouflage or the poor eyesight of British officers who refused to wear spectacles for fear of appearing unmanly. You suspect it's a bit of both. You've watched British scouts scan your ridge with high-powered brass telescopes, their lenses occasionally flashing in the sun like a beacon. You, however, keep your eyes squinted, looking through the fringe of your shaggy headcloth. You've learned that the eye is drawn to movement and straight lines. By staying still and masking your rifle's silhouette, you force the British to look at you without ever seeing you. It's a psychological game of hide-and-seek, where the loser doesn't get found, they get buried. You remember a fringe detail about a British captain who tried to solve the sniper problem by ordering his men to fire at any unusual-looking rock. You spent an entire afternoon watching from a safe distance as a company of soldiers wasted hundreds of rounds of ammunition on a particularly lumpy boulder while you sat 10 feet away, disguised as a patch of withered grass. The British are obsessed with order and symmetry. They look for things that don't belong. You belong here more than the rocks themselves. Your camouflage is more than just a suit. It's an identity. It's the physical manifestation of your refusal to be categorized or captured. The trickiest part of your invisibility is managing your signature. Even if you are perfectly hidden, the smell of your cooking fire, the glint of a water tin, or the scent of your tobacco can betray you. You eat your food, cold, usually a hard, dry bread called naan, and you've learned to bury your waist deep in the sand. You don't use the scented oils the British prefer for their weapons. You use the rank, heavy fat of a mountain sheep. It smells like the herds that roam these hills, a scent so common the British soldiers' noses have long since become blind to it. You are blending into the olfactory landscape as much as the visual one. As the sun begins to move across the sky, you have to adjust your position. A shadow that was protecting you at 10 in the morning might leave you exposed by 2 in the afternoon. This is the slow dance of the sniper. You move with the shadows, sliding an inch every few minutes, keeping yourself in the cooling blue-green patches of the cliffside. You've noticed that the British soldiers tend to bunch up in the shade of their wagons during the heat of the day. They think the shade is their friend, but to you, it's a frame. It highlights them against the bright background, making them perfect high-contrast targets. You think back to the crocodile dung story yet? It's funny how the British always look for the exotic explanation. They want to believe you have some savage secret for your invisibility. They don't want to admit that you're just more patient, more disciplined, and more observant than they are. You check your reflection in a small pool of rainwater trapped in a stone hollow. You don't see a man. You see a pile of dust and wool. You are ready? The British are preparing their afternoon tea, the smoke from their fires rising in thin, lazy columns. They are comfortable. They think they are alone in this vast, empty landscape. You settle your shaggy, mud-caked arm onto a rock and prepare to prove them wrong. The officer's mess is the beating heart of British morale, a strange island of starched linen and silver forks floating in a sea of hostile dust. From your overwatch, you can see the white canvas of the command tent, illuminated from within by the warm glow of oil lamps as evening falls. It is a mainstream historical fact that British officers in the late Victorian era insisted on maintaining the trappings of gentlemanly life, even in the most brutal environments, often dining on 5-course meals while their men shared hardtack and water just a few yards away. This cultural stubbornness is your greatest tactical asset. You don't need to kill 100 privates to stop an army. You just need to disrupt the comfort of the men who make the decisions. You watch as the orderlies move between the tents. Carrying trays of gin and tonic drink, the British believe protects them from malaria. Though you know them only as the bitter water, the officers gather in the open air, thinking the camp's perimeter of armed sentries and flickering campfires provides a wall of safety. They are wrong. You are sitting 1,200 yards away, a distance they consider out of range for the local Jaziles. But your rifle is a specialized beast, and the air tonight is heavy and still, perfect for a long-distance delivery. You probably wouldn't survive the audacity of this shot if you didn't have a pre-planned escape route that involves a literal leap of faith into a hidden ravine. One quirky fringe tidbit about these mountain campaigns is that some British colonels were so obsessed with status that they brought along their own personal wine cellars and even grand pianos on the backs of weary camels. You once watched a piano tumble down a slope during a skirmish, the strings snapping with a sound like a chorus of dying ghosts. Tonight, however, the target is more refined. You are looking for the nerve of the command. You've noticed that when a senior officer is removed during his most civilized moment, while raising a glass or cutting into a piece of imported ham, the psychological impact on the survivors is devastating. It shatters the illusion that their rank or their civilization offers any protection against the mountain's judgment. Historians still argue whether the targeting of officers was a deliberate strategy to decapitate command, or simply a result of snipers aiming for the most colorful targets. For you, it is purely strategic. A sergeant major can be replaced by a dozen capable corporals, but a high-ranking officer carries the maps, the codes, and the specific vision of the London War Office. When you squeeze the trigger, you aren't just killing a man, you are burning a library of tactical information. You recall that crocodile dung sunscreen anecdote? The British are so focused on the absurdity of the natives that they unfathom you are performing a surgical strike on their leadership hierarchy. You settle the long, heavy barrel of the Jazeo onto a flat stone. You've spent the last hour calculating the drop of the heavy lead ball over this immense distance. At 1,200 yards, the bullet will travel in a massive arc, falling onto the target like a stone dropped from heaven. You have to aim nearly 20 feet above the tent to account for gravity. This isn't just shooting, it's ballistics and intuition. You see a man step into the light of a lamp, a colonel, by the look of his shoulder tabs. He is laughing, his head tilted back. In his world, the war is something that happens out there, beyond the camp lights. In your world, the war is everywhere. The report of the Jazelle is a low, rolling boom that the valley walls catch and play with, turning a single shot into a confusing symphony of echoes. Because of the distance, the bullet arrives nearly 2 seconds after you fire, long before the sound of the shot reaches their ears. You watch through your sights as the colonel's glass of gin shatters, followed an instant later by the man himself collapsing into the fold-out table. The mess erupts into a chaos of overturned chairs and shouted commands. The invincibility of the mess has been pierced. The silence that follows the initial shouting is the sound of an entire command structure losing its nerve. You don't wait to see the aftermath. You are already sliding backward, your camouflaged shawl blending with the dark shale. By tomorrow morning, the rumor will spread through the British ranks that the ghost can strike from the very stars. The soldiers will start looking at their own officers, not as leaders, but as magnets for death. This is the true goal of your strategic assassination campaign: to make the cost of leadership too high to pay. You've heard of a fringe debate among scholars where they suggest some snipers were actually trained by European mercenaries. But the truth is simpler. The mountain is the only teacher you've ever needed. As you move away, you think about the silver forks and the white linen. They are symbols of a world that doesn't understand the grit and the blood of the frontier. The British think they can bring their dining rooms into the Hindu Kush and remain unchanged. You are the reminder that the mountain changes everyone, or it breaks them. You reach your secondary nest and begin the slow process of cleaning your rifle by the light of the moon. The British will spend the night in total darkness, too afraid to light a single lamp, shivering in the cold. You, the hunter of the mess, have stolen their light. The arrival of the Malakand field force signals a change in the wind, a sharpening of the Empire's teeth. Down in the valley, the dust clouds are thicker, kicked up by thousands of boots and the heavy wheels of the mountain batteries. Among the new arrivals is a young, ambitious subaltern with a prominent chin and a restless energy, a man named Winston Churchill. It is a mainstream historical fact that Churchill served as both a soldier and a war correspondent during this campaign. Sending home dispatches that painted the frontier as a place of savage beauty and relentless danger, you watch him from the heights, noting how he sits his horse with a certain theatrical flair. He is here to write history, but you are here to ensure that history is written in the blood of the overconfident. The pressure is intensifying. The British are no longer just reacting. They are pushing into the heart of the Swat Valley with a systematic scorched earth policy. They are burning the towers of silence, the fortified family homestand, cutting down the ancient mulberry trees that provide the villages with food. This escalation is designed to draw you out, to force the invisible foe into a desperate, hidden confrontation. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer weight of their numbers if you fought on their terms. But the Malakand field force is a clumsy giant. They move with an immense baggage train that stretches for miles, a vulnerable tail that you can sting at your leisure while their vanguard is busy looking for a fight that doesn't exist. One quirky fringe tidbit from this specific campaign is that some British officers, frustrated by the invisible snipers, began to carry decoy hatspith helmets on sticks to draw fire. You've seen this trick before, and it always makes you chuckle. You don't aim for the hat, you aim for the elbow of the man holding the stick. You've also heard that Churchill himself was fascinated by the sporting nature of the frontier warfare, comparing it to a high-stakes game of polo. To him, it is an adventure. To you, it is the survival of your lineage. You watch as he scribbles in a notebook, perhaps recording the very unseen shots you are firing from the ridges. Historians still argue whether the 1897 uprising was a coordinated Great Jihad sparked by the Mad Mullah of Swat, or a series of localized explosions of resentment. From your perch, the distinction is meaningless. Whether a man fights for God or for his grandfather's land, the lead ball from his Jozil flies the same. You see the Malakand field force as a test of your strategic patience. They have brought the new Lee Metford rifles, which fire high-velocity smokeless powder. This is a significant threat. For the first time, the British can shoot back without a cloud of white smoke giving away their own positions. The invisible death is no longer your exclusive franchise. You decide to target the column's intelligence rather than its muscle. You've identified a local guide, a man from a southern tribe who is selling his knowledge of the hidden paths to the British. In the logic of Pashtunwali, he is the lowest of the Loa Casadar, who has betrayed the salt. But instead of killing him outright, you use the shadow of the force to your advantage. You fire a shot that grazes his horse's ear, then another that kicks up dust at his feet. You aren't trying to hit him, you're trying to make the British think he is leading them into an ambush. Within an hour, you watch as the British officers begin to argue with the guide, their faces red with suspicion. You've neutralized the guide's value without wasting a single lethal shot. The logistics of the Malakand force are failing under the weight of the summer heat. You recall that crocodile dung story. The British are so busy inventing reasons for their failures that they miss the obvious. They are wearing heavy serge uniforms in a climate that demands light cotton. They are drinking water from stagnant pools. While you know where the hidden springs are located, you watch as the mountain guns are dismantled and loaded onto mules to navigate the narrow zigzags of the pass. This is the moment of maximum vulnerability. A mule that slips can block the entire force for hours. You wait for the most awkward turn in the trail. And you don't shoot a soldier, you shoot the lead mule of the ammunition train. The chaos that follows is a symphony of braying animals and swearing men. The mountain gunners struggle to right their loads while the infantry tries to scramble up the slopes to find the source of the shot. You are already a mile away, moving through a nullah that is invisible from the main trail. You think about Churchill and his dispatches. He will likely write about the treachery of the tribes and the heroic struggle of the soldiers against the terrain. He won't write about the fact that a single man with a handmade rifle and a bag of parched grain just halted an entire brigade's progress for half a day. He won't understand that the rising pressure of the British force is actually their undoing, making them heavier and slower when they need to be light and fast. As evening falls, the Malakand field force huddles in its camp, the men exhausted and jittery. They have the power to level a village, but they don't have the power to catch a shadow. You watch the flickering lights of their bivouacs, feeling the cool night air settle into the valley. You are the hidden story of this campaign, the one that doesn't make it into the official history books or the memoirs of future prime ministers. You are the friction that wears down the gears of the empire. You take a final look at the camp, center your sights on the largest cooking pot you can find, and put a hole right through its center. Let them eat their cold rations tonight. The pressure is on, but you are the one who controls the valve. The logistics of the long shot are less about the moment you pull the trigger and more about the hours you spend over a small, smokeless fire in a mountain cavern playing the part of an amateur chemist and a master blacksmith. To the British, a bullet is a mass-produced cylinder of lead and nickel delivered in a wooden crate. To you, every ball is a hand-wrought piece of destiny. It is a mainstream historical fact that the frontier workshops of the tribal areas were surprisingly sophisticated, capable of reverse engineering British firearms, and even producing their own gunpowder from local sulfur and saltpeter. You know the exact recipe for your black Golda mixture that is grittier and more temperamental than the British cordite, but one that you have mastered through a lifetime of trial and error. You probably wouldn't survive the volatility of your own powder if you didn't know the feel of it. When you load your Jozeel, you aren't just pouring in a measure. You are listening to the sound the grains make against the iron. You've learned that on humid days, the powder burns slower, requiring you to hold over your target just a hair more. While the British follow ballistics tables printed in manuals, you rely on a sensory library of thousands of previous shots. You know that at 500 yards, your heavy ball will be pushed 6 inches to the left by a breeze you can barely feel on your eyelashes. One quirky fringe tidbit about the Pashtun marksmen is that they would often weight their lead balls with a tiny core of heavier metal, like scavenged gold, or even small bits of iron, to give them better sectional density for punching through the thick leather of British saddles. You have a small stash of special balls for long-range work, each one polished with a piece of silk until it shines like a dark pearl. You've even learned to account for the temperature of the barrel. The first shot from a cold Jozeel will always fly slightly higher than the second. A professional like you never forgets that the iron is alive and has its own moods. Historians still argue whether the transition from flintlock to percussion cap was the single most important technological leap for the frontier tribes. You've seen both, and while the percussion cap is more reliable in the rain, you prefer the flintlock for its independence. You don't need a factory in Birmingham to make a piece of flint. You just need the right kind of stone and a steady hand to nap it. You recall that crocodile dung sunscreen anecdote from the Traveler's Itses, the same kind of colonial myth as the idea that tribal rifles were inaccurate. They were only inaccurate if you tried to fire them like a British soldier, standing in a line and closing your eyes. In your hands, the Jozeel is a surgical instrument. Today, your target is a British ammunition wagon, specifically the heavy wooden axle. If you can shatter that wood with a heavy lead ball, the entire column stops. You are positioned on a spectator's ridge over 800 yards from the trail. The wind is a fishtail, switching directions every few seconds. You wait, your finger resting lightly on the curved trigger, watching the grass on the slope between you and the wagon. You aren't looking at the target, you're looking at the air. When the grass bows toward the west in a consistent wave, you know the window is open. You take a breath, hold it in the bottom of your lungs, and let the long barrel of the jazal find its home. The explosion of the black powder is more than a sound. It's a physical push against your entire body. At this range, the flight of the ball feels like an eternity. You have time to blink, to see the puff of dust on the far ridge, and then crack the sound of seasoned oak splintering. The wagon lurches, the rear wheels spinning off into the ditch. The logistics of the long shot have just turned a mobile infantry unit into a stationary target. The British will spend the next 4 hours trying to jack up a Teuton wagon in a sniper-s alley, their frustration growing with every minute the sun climbs higher. You remember a fringe detail about a British officer who claimed the snipers used poisoned bullets. You laugh at the thought. Why waste poison when a half ounce of lead traveling at 1,200 feet per second does the job perfectly? The only poison you use is the psychological rot of uncertainty. By hitting the machinery instead of the men, you've forced them into a manual labor detail that they hate. You watch them sweating, their officers shouting contradictory orders, and you realize that you've won this engagement without taking a single life. It's cleaner this way. It keeps the blood debt from spiraling out of control while still achieving your strategic goal. As you pack your gear, you carefully wipe down the frizz in the metal plate the flint strikes to ensure no moisture lingers. Your logistics are personal. Your supply chain is a hidden cache of powder in a dry cave and a bag of lead under a specific flat stone. You are a one-man army with a zero-cost infrastructure. The British, meanwhile, are currently calculating how many thousands of pounds it will cost to replace that wagon and the delay it has caused to their forward policy. You slide into the shadows of a chimney of rock, the long barrel of your jazil pointing toward the sky like a finger of the mountain itself. Tomorrow, you'll move to the southern pass. But for now, you are a ghost who has successfully audited the Empire's books. The wind in the Hindu Kush is not just a weather pattern. It is a sentient, temperamental beast that speaks a language only the dead and the patient truly understand. As you crouch in a shallow depression high above the Swat Valley, a Himalayan storm begins to roll in, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The temperature drops 20 degrees in as many minutes, and the air takes on a metallic electric charge. It is a mainstream historical fact that the British military, for all its technological prowess, was frequently paralyzed by the extreme weather of the frontier, where flash floods could sweep away entire camps and mountain snows could bury a battalion in hours. For you, however, the storm is a cloak of shifting, chaotic landscape where the interrogation of the wind becomes your most vital skill. You probably wouldn't survive the biting cold of this altitude without your patu, the heavy hand-woven wool shawl that serves as your blanket, your camouflage, and your wind. While the British soldiers are huddled under thin canvas tents that flap and tear in the gale, you are tucked into the mountain's own ribs. You watch the wind play with the dust on the valley floor, noting the way it swirls in dust devils near the mouth of the canyon. This tells you that the wind is stacking against the cliffs, creating an updraft that would carry a standard bullet high above its mark. To make a shot in this weather, you have to read the invisible currents like a sailor reads the sea. One quirky fringe tidbit about these mountain storms is the phenomenon of silent lightning electric discharges that illuminate the peaks without a sound, casting a strobe-like flicker over the terrain. In these moments, you can see the British pickets clearly for a split second, their eyes wide with the primal fear of the heights. You've heard that some British officers believed the tribes possessed a sixth sense for weather, perhaps even the ability to summon the storms. You don't summon the storm, you simply wait for it to do the heavy lifting for you. When the rain finally breaks, it comes down in sheets of gray glass, turning the dry nullahs into raging torrents of mud and bone-crushing boulders. Historians still argue whether the legendary invincibility of the Pashtun sniper was simply a matter of the British being unable to see through the mist and sleet. You know it's deeper than that. The storm levels the playing field. The British Lammetford rifles, with their delicate sights and high-velocity rounds, are actually more affected by crosswinds than your heavy, slow-moving lead ball. Your bullet is like a bowling ball thrown through a gale. Its sheer mass gives it a momentum of indifference that the lighter British rounds lack. You watch through the haze as a British unit attempts to retreat to higher ground. Their boots slipping on the slick shale, their cohesion dissolving into a mess of shivering, wet humanity. The weather has changed the tactical landscape. The British heliographs are useless in the gloom, and their telegraph lines have been snapped by falling rocks. They are isolated, blind, and cold. You decide to use this static to settle a specific strategic debt. There is a British captain who has been particularly effective at using his own mountain guns to suppress tribal movements. In the clear light of day, he is untouchable behind his sangar walls. But in the storm, the sangar is a trap. You move through the rain, the water slicking your beard, your jazel wrapped in a greased animal skin to keep the pan dry. You aren't just a marksman now. You are a part of the storm itself. You remember a fringe detail about a British meteorologist who tried to map the vortex patterns of the Khyber region to predict these storms. He failed because he didn't realize the mountains create their own weather through a conversation between the sun-baked rock and the glacial peaks. You understand this conversation instinctively. You know that when the wind whistles through a specific needle-eye rock formation to your left, it means the gale will die down for exactly 10 seconds, a window of relative calm. You wait for that whistle. You uncover the lock of your jazel, the flint dry and ready. The shot, when it comes, is muffled by the roar of the rain. The flash of the powder is instantly swallowed by the gray light. The captain, standing at the edge of his tent to check the drainage, is struck by a lead ball that has traveled through a curtain of water that would have deflected any other projectile. To his men, it would look like he was struck by a piece of flying debris or a stray bolt of lightning. The interrogation of the wind has yielded its answer. You are already moving before the body hits the mud, sliding down a familiar chute of wet gravel that takes you hundreds of feet below the British position in seconds. As the storm begins to break, leaving behind a world that smells of ozone and wet earth, the British find themselves in a transformed landscape. Paths have disappeared, landmarks have shifted, and their leadership has been thinned by a ghost that the wind itself seems to protect. You find a dry overhang and begin the meticulous process of drying your rifle, piece by piece. The storm was a tool, but the maintenance is a duty. You think back to that crocodile dung joke. The British will likely blame the unhealthy mountain air for their losses today. Let them. As long as they fear the sky and the wind, they will never truly own the ground. The bazaar in Landikoel is a kaleidoscope of smells: roasting mutton, pungent snuff, unwashed wool, and the sharp metallic temps of gun oil, but for you, it is the most dangerous terrain in the frontier. In the mountains, you are a ghost, but here in the crowded stalls, you are a man with a face, a history, and a price on your head. You've come here to trade for high-quality English gunpowder, stolen from the British magazines and sold by the gram like spice. It is a mainstream historical fact that the bazaars of the northwest frontier were hotbeds of espionage, where the British political agents employed a vast network of informers to track the movements of tribal leaders. You probably wouldn't survive the paranoia of this place if you had mastered the art of hiding in the crowd just as effectively as hiding in the shale. You are sitting in the back of a small tea shop, your shaggy patu pulled low, watching the world through the steam of a brass cup. Across from you sits a man you've known since childhood, distant cousin from a rival clan. He is smiling, offering you a sweetmeat, but his eyes are constantly darting toward a group of Khyber Rifles sepoys standing by the gate. This is the betrayal in the bazaar, a tactical hazard more lethal than a British mountain gun. In the mountains, the rules are clear. You see the enemy, you shoot. Here, the enemy might be the person pouring your tea. Historians still argue whether the British successfully managed to buy the loyalty of certain tribes, but you know that loyalty here isn't bought, it's leased, and the rent is paid in blood and silver. One quirky fringe tidbit about these frontier markets is that the British would often salt the local economy with counterfeit coins that contained a tiny specific impurity, allowing their agents to trace where the money was spent. UV learned to check every silver rupee by biting it and smelling it for the faint scent of acid used in the forgery process. But today, the currency being traded is information. You notice your cousin's hand twitching toward his waistband, and you see a subtle nod toward the sepoys. He has made a calculation. The British bounty for the ghosts of the past is worth more to him than the bond of distant kinship. You feel the cold weight of the blood feud shifting. He isn't just a relative anymore, he is a target. You don't reach for your weapon. That would be a death sentence in this confined space. Instead, you use the noise of the bazaar. You wait for a string of pack camels to be driven through the narrow lane, creating a momentary wall of dusty, braying animals. In that split second of chaos, you don't run for the gate. You slide behind the Teesler's charcoal brazier and up a rickety ladder to the flat roof. You've spent weeks scouting these rooftops, knowing that the British and their informants always look at the ground. You move silently across the sun-baked mud bricks, the smell of wood smoke thick in your lungs, while below you, the sepoys rush into the tea shop with their bayonets fixed. You recall a fringe detail about a British officer who claimed that the Pathan could disappear like a puff of smoke in a crowded room. It's not smoke, it's preparation. While your cousin and the soldiers are searching the back rooms and overturning tables, you are 3 buildings away, descending into a hidden alleyway used by the sweepers. You've narrowly escaped a trap set by a man who shares your grandfather's name. This is the reality of the strategic assassination campaign. You are fighting 2 wars. One is against the redcoats in the valley, and the other is against the jealousy and greed of your own neighbors. You realize that your cousin knows too much about your patterns, your favorite Overwatch spots, and your reliance on the blood feud cover. The betrayal has changed your tactical map. You cannot return to your usual caches. You have to assume that every safe cave is now a potential ambush site. This is the psychological toll of the bazaar. It strips away your trust and replaces it with a cold, analytical loneliness. You find a small secondary exit from the Tauna drainage tunnel that smells of stagnant water and rot. As you crawl through the darkness, you think about the man you just left behind. He thinks he's won because he's still in the tea shop, but he has just signed his own death warrant under the code of badal. Revenge doesn't have to be a bullet. Sometimes it's just the memory of a face in the steam. Historians still argue whether the British political department was more effective than the military department in pacifying the frontier. From your perspective, the silver of the bazaar is more dangerous than the lead of the battlefield. It turns brother against brother and creates a climate of suspicion that can paralyze a resistance more effectively than a blockade. You remember that crocodile dung joke: the British spend so much time laughing at your primitive culture that they do unsee the sophisticated betrayal they've engineered with a few bags of coin. But they forget one thing: the mountain doesn't accept bribes. You emerge from the tunnel a mile outside the town, the sun hitting your face like a physical blow. You are alive, but you are more of a ghost than ever. You have no home to go back to tonight, only the high ridges where the wind doesn't care about silver or kinship. You look back at the walls of Landic Hotel, seeing the dust kick up as the British cavalry begins a sweep of the perimeter. They are looking for a man in a shaggy shawl. But you've already discarded it for a plain cotton wrap stolen from a clothesline. You are the invisible thread that refuses to be woven into their tapestry. As you begin the long climb back to the heights, you feel a new weight in your soul. The weight of a debt that must be settled before the moon sets. The dynamic of the mountain has shifted. You can feel it in the way the British patrols no longer wander aimlessly through the valleys. They have stopped being the prey and have started acting like hunters. This is because they have finally brought in their own specialista man, the scouts. Whisper about in the bazaars as the captain of the long rifles. He is a counter-sniper, a man chosen not for his ability to lead a charge, but for his ability to sit as still as you do. This is a deadly game of tag, where the person who doesn't just lose the round, they lose their life. It is a mainstream historical fact that the British military, realizing the devastating effect of tribal sharpshooters, began to recruit Lovett scouts and other specialized marksmen from the Scottish Highlands, men whose upbringing in the rugged mists of the north gave them a similar temperament to the Pashtun. You probably wouldn't survive this new phase of the war if you did respect your opponent. This man isn't like the subalterns with their shiny buttons and loud voices. You've been watching him through your own sights for 2 days. He wears a dull, custom-dyed tunic that nearly matches the gray of the granite. And he moves with a slow, rhythmic caution that mirrors your own ghost crawl. He isn't looking for a crowd of warriors. He is looking for a single, misplaced shadow, a glint of brass, or the smell of wood smoke. This is the first time in your campaign that you've felt the sting of being hunted. It's a chilling sensation, like a cold finger tracing the line of your spine. One quirky fringe tidbit about these early counter-sniper duels is that the British started experimenting with periscope rifles' crude arrangements of mirrors that allowed them to fire from behind a rock without exposing their heads. You've seen him using one. You watched as the muzzle of a rifle appeared over a ledge, fired a shot that missed your ear by an inch, and then vanished. It's a clever trick, but it has a weakness. The mirrors have a narrow field of vision. He can see what's directly in front of him, but he's blind to his periphery. Historians still argue whether these specialized units were officially sanctioned or if they were the private wars of obsessive officers. But to you, the paperwork doesn't matter. The lead does. You decide to lure him into a forced error. You know that a hunter's greatest weakness is his own success. You find a spot where a natural chimney of rock provides a perfect exit, and you set a dummy position. You take an old wool cap and prop it up on a stick behind a cluster of stones, just enough so that the very top of it is visible. To a regular soldier, it looks like nothing. To a professional hunter, it looks like a sniper trying to be clever. You then retreat 50 yards to a much higher, much more uncomfortable crevice that requires you to wedge your body into a V shape that would make a normal man cramp in minutes. The wait is agonizing. The sun moves across the sky, baking the rocks until they radiate a dry, dusty heat. You see a flicker of movement on the opposite ridge, a tiny flash of light, no larger than a dragonfly's wing. It's the lens of his telescope. He's found the cap. You watch as he takes his time, adjusting his position, probably calculating the wind, just as you taught yourself to do. You feel a strange, detached sense of kinship with him in this moment. He's the only person in this entire valley who understands the level of discipline required to do what you do. But in the mountains, there is only room for one ghost. The shot from the British rifle is different from the boom of your Giselle. It's a sharp, high-pitched crack, the sound of a modern small-bore bullet breaking the sound barrier. You see the wool cap fly off the stick, shredded by the impact. The counter-sniper has taken the bait. Now, you have exactly 3 seconds. He will be looking through his sights to confirm the kill, his focus narrowed to that single point of impact. You shift your Giselle, the long barrel sliding over the velvet-lined rest you've made from a piece of old saddle. You don't aim for where he fired from. You aim for the spot 6 inches to the left, where a man would naturally roll to reload a bolt-action rifle. You recall a fringe detail about how the British were trying to develop smokeless cartridges to make their snipers truly invisible. This man is using them, but he can't hide the heat shimmer that rises from a hot barrel. You see that tiny, wobbly distortion in the air. You take a half breath, hold it, and squeeze. The Giselle roars, and the heavy lead ball crosses the canyon in a lazy, terrifying arc. You don't see him die. You only see a sudden, violent puff of dust and the glint of a rifle falling down the cliff face, bouncing off the rocks with a hollow metallic clang. The duel is over. The ghost of the peaks remains, but the victory feels different this time. You've killed a man who was your mirror image. You realize that the British aren't just a clumsy giant anymore. They are learning. They are adapting to your terrain, your tactics, and your silence. You probably wouldn't survive a second encounter if you stayed in this valley. You begin the process of packing your gear. Your hands slightly trembling, not from fear, but from the release of a day's worth of concentrated adrenaline. You need to find a new mountain, a new cover, and a new way to stay invisible. The game of tag has ended, but the war of the shadows is just beginning. The transition from the solitary silence of the ridges to the crowded, volatile atmosphere of the Jurgatha tribal council is a shock to your senses. Here, under the shade of a massive ancient plane tree, the air is thick with the scent of green tea, tobacco, and the unspoken tension of men who carry knives as part of their formal attire. You are no longer the ghost. You are a clansman among equals, sitting on a colorful but worn rug, listening to the elders debate the future of the valley. It is a mainstream historical fact that the British found the Jurga system nearly impossible to navigate, as it was a pure democracy where every man had a vote and no single chief could truly speak for the whole tribe. You watch the British political agent sitting on the periphery, looking uncomfortable in his stiff collar, trying to bribe the room with promises of subsidies and infrastructure. You probably wouldn't. Survived the shifting loyalties of this circle. If you did, you know how to play the part of the humble shepherd. You sit near the back, your hands roughed and stained with lead and gunpowder tucked into your sleeves. The debate is fierce. Some elders argue for a formal peace treaty with the Raj, citing the destruction of the mulberry groves and the mounting hunger in the villages. Others, their voices rising with the fire of the Mad Mullah's rhetoric, demand a full-scale holy war. You realize that your strategic campaign is at a crossroads. If the council votes for peace, your blood feud cover will evaporate. If they vote for war, you will be expected to join the massed charges that lead to certain slaughter. One quirky fringe tidbit about these councils is the role of the pot warrior. In the middle of a heated political debate, a man might stand up, and recite a long rhythmic poem about a battle from 300 years ago to prove a point about modern honor. You listen as an old man speaks of the Iron General of the past, using the rhythm of his words to hypnotize the crowd. Historians still argue whether these oral traditions were a form of primitive propaganda or a genuine repository of tribal law. To you, it's a distraction. You are watching the eyes of the men in the inner circle. You see who is leaning toward the British agent S. Silver and who is gripping their rifle a little too tightly. The British agent stands to speak, his translator struggling to capture the nuances of the local dialect. He talks about the inevitability of progress and the benevolence of the Queen Empress. You see a few of the younger men nod. They are tired of the hiding and the hunger. This is where your second war, the War of Whispers, begins. You don't stand up to give a speech that would draw too much attention to your face. Instead, you lean over to the man next to you and whisper a fact you've carefully prepared, that the British agent S. Silver coins were actually confiscated from a local shrine in the south. Within 10 minutes, that whisper has traveled around the circle like a wildfire. The atmosphere shifts from cautious curiosity to cold, simmering hostility. You recall a fringe detail about a British officer who tried to use a graphophone nan, early recording device to capture the proceedings of a jirga to analyze the tribal dynamics later. The tribesman, convinced it was a soul-stealing machine, smashed it with a rock before it could record a single word. You feel a similar urge toward the British agent's ledger. That book contains names, dates, and family trees, the very things you've spent months obfuscating. You realize that the blood feud narrative you've built is being threatened by the British desire for transparency. They want to categorize every death, and if they do, they will eventually find the pattern that leads to you. The council lasts for 6 hours. By the end, the British agent is dismissed with a polite but firm refusal of his gifts. The loyalties have shifted back toward resistance, but it is a fragile, jagged kind of loyalty. As the men stand to leave, you find yourself face-to-face with the chieftain whose daughter was allegedly insulted the feud. You used as cover for your third assassination. He looks at you with a piercing, suspicious intensity. He knows his family didn't kill that British engineer, and he's starting to wonder who did. You hold his gaze with the blank, steady eyes of a man who has spent too much time looking through a sight. "The mountains have long memories," he says quietly, before turning away. This is the danger of the jirga. Words are as sharp as daggers, and a misplaced sentence can be as lethal as a lead ball. You've successfully pushed the tribe back toward conflict, buying your campaign more time, but you've also increased the scrutiny on your own movements. You realize that the hidden story of your life is becoming a legend, and legends are harder to hide than men. You probably wouldn't survive the night if the chieftain acted on his hunch. But in the world of Pashtunwali, suspicion is not proof. He will wait for evidence, and you will make sure he never finds any. As the moon rises over the plane tree, you slip away from the village, leaving the warmth of the fires for the cold comfort of the heights. The jirga has decided on a path of defiance, which means the British will send more troops, more surveyors, and more targets. You feel a grim sense of relief. In the chaos of a renewed uprising, a few more accidental deaths among the British command will go unnoticed. You reach into your pouch and touch the cool, smooth surface of a lead ball. The council has spoken, but the final vote will be cast from a ridge 300 yards above the road. The moon is a sliver of bone over the valley of the Mammon, and below you, the night is alive with the orange flicker of torchlight and the rhythmic chanting of 500 warriors. This is the siege of a British outpost, a small, square sangar made of stacked stone and sandbags perched precariously on a spur of land. The tribal raid is loud, chaotic, and frontal. Exactly the kind of savage warfare the British are trained to repel with their disciplined volleys. But you are not part of the shouting mass. You are 300 yards away, tucked into a natural stone embrasure that smells of dry moss and ancient dust. You are using the spectacular chaos of the raid as a curtain of noise to perform a series of very specific, very quiet removals. It is a mainstream historical fact that these frontier outposts were often isolated for weeks, their only connection to the world being the frantic flashes of a heliograph or the occasional desperate runner. To the British soldiers inside, the night is a nightmare of sniping and screaming, a psychological war of attrition. You watch through your sights as the tribal warriors throw themselves at the perimeter, drawing the British fire and illuminating the interior of the outpost with every muzzle flash. You probably wouldn't survive the stupidity of that frontal charge, but you admire their bravery. It provides you with the perfect high-noise environment to eliminate the outpost's only doctor and its senior signals sergeant. One quirky fringe tidbit about these night sieges is that the British would sometimes use Star Shell's primitive magnesium flares to light up the hillsides. When a shell bursts, the world turns a blinding skeletal white, and for 5 seconds, you have to be as still as a statue. You learn to close one eye when the flare pops to preserve your night vision in the other. Historians still argue whether these tribal raids were intended to capture ground or merely to blood the young men of the village. For you, the raid is a laboratory. You see a British officer standing on a crate, his silhouette framed by the flare's light. He's trying to organize a countercharge. You wait for the exact moment a tribal matchlock fires in the valley, a loud, booming distraction, and you take your shot. The officer falls backward, but in the cacophony of the siege, his men assume he was hit by a stray ball from the hundreds being fired from the valley floor. This is the beauty of the siege overwatch. You are picking the locks of the British defense while they are busy trying to hold the door shut. Identified the signals sergeant, the man who knows how to operate the telegraph key that connects this outpost to the main garrison at Malkand. If he dies, this outpost becomes an island. You watch him through the shifting smoke, a man illuminated by the glow of a lantern inside the command hut. You breathe out, the cold night air misting in front of your face, and squeeze. The lantern shatters, and the signal sergeant collapses into the darkness. You recall a fringe detail about a British survivor who claimed the snipers during the Mammoth uprising were supernaturally accurate in the dark. There is no magic to it. There is only the study of index points. You've spent the daylight hours memorizing the height of the walls, the position of the hut doors, and the gaps in the sandbags. In the dark, you aren't aiming at a person. You are aiming at a coordinate where you know a person must be. You probably wouldn't survive the scrutiny of a modern forensic team, but here, the only autopsy will be performed by a panicked corporal with a dull knife and a flickering candle. The raid begins to pull back as the first gray light of dawn touches the peaks. The tribesmen have done their job. They've exhausted the British ammunition and broken the garrison's sleep. They melt back into the shadows of the ravines, carrying their wounded and shouting insults at the walls. You remain. The post-siege hours are the most productive for a strategic assassin. The British will come out of their cover to count the bodies and repair the walls, their guard lowered by the relief of surviving the night. You watch as a young lieutenant steps out to inspect the damage to the telegraph wire. He is the last high-value target on your list for this location. You remember that crocodile dung joke. The British will spend the morning writing reports about the massed tribal ferocity, never realizing that the most effective damage was done by a single man who never raised his voice. You settled the Jazeel on its rest, the wood feeling icy against your cheek. The lieutenant is kneeling by the wire, his back to you. You take the shot, and the recoil is a sharp, familiar punch. He falls forward into the dust, and you are already moving, sliding into a narrow crevice that leads to the back of the ridge. The siege of the outpost is over for the tribesmen, but for the British, the mystery of their specific targeted losses is just beginning. As you trek away from the smoldering outpost, the sun begins to warm the rocks, and the adrenaline of the night starts to fade into a Banadeep wariness. You've successfully decapitated the local command and cut their communications, all while making it look like the unfortunate result of a chaotic skirmish. You find a hidden spring and wash the sulfur from your face, the cold water stinging your skin. The British will send a relief column tomorrow, but they will find an outpost that is blind, mute, and leaderless. You are the shadow that lingers after the fire has gone out, the hidden story that the official casualty lists will never truly explain. Living on the knife edge of a mountain ridge for weeks on end requires a level of physical stoicism that the British Tommies in the valley can barely conceive of, while they wait for the rumble of the supply wagons bringing tins of bully beef and sacks of potatoes. Your entire logistics chain is contained within a small, grizzly-stained leather pouch tied to your waist. This is the unglamorous reality of the sniper's diet, a survivalist's menu designed for efficiency, silence, and the prevention of the one thing that can kill a sniper faster than a bullet, a rumbling stomach or a coughing fit. You are currently living on a rotation of 3 things: hard naan bread, sundried mulberries, and the occasional piece of landry which is salted air-dried mutton that is as tough as the sole of a boot. It is a mainstream historical fact that the tribes of the Northwest frontier were among the most physically resilient people on the planet, capable of marching 50 miles over vertical terrain with nothing but a handful of dried fruit for sustenance. You probably wouldn't survive the metabolic shock of this diet if you hadn't been raised on it. The dried mulberries are your high-energy fuel. They are packed with sugar and don't require a fire to prepare. A fire is a beacon for British Scouts and creates a scent that can travel for miles in the crisp mountain air. So, you chew the berries slowly, letting the sugar hit your bloodstream in a steady trickle, keeping your mind sharp and your hands steady. One quirky fringe tidbit about the diet of the Jazayilki is their use of bitter almonds to suppress the urge to cough or sneeze. In the stillness of an overwatch, a single sneeze can be a death sentence. You carry a few of these nuts, and when you feel that tickle in your throat, you chew one. The bitterness is so intense, it shocks your system, distracting your nerves and keeping you silent. Historians still argue whether the miraculous endurance of the hill tribes was due to genetics or a lifetime of caloric restriction. From your perspective, it's just physics. A lighter body requires less oxygen and makes less noise when moving over shale. You are a biological machine stripped of all excess weight, a predator that doesn't need a kitchen to be lethal. You recall a fringe detail about a British officer who attempted to live like a local for a week to understand your endurance. He was evacuated by his men on the 4th day, suffering from extreme exhaustion and a shattered constitution. He didn't understand that the diet isn't just about the food, it's about the mindset of scarcity. You don't eat until you are full. You eat until the hunger stops being a distraction. You drink water by the capful, savoring the metallic temps of the mountain spring. You may even learn to chew on a smooth pebble to keep your mouth from drying out during the long, parched hours of the afternoon sun. It's a low-tech solution that keeps you focused on the sights of your rifle rather than the thirst in your throat. The physical toll of this lifestyle is visible in the mirror of a still mountain pool. Your ribs are prominent, your skin is like tanned leather, and your eyes have the sunken, hyper-alert look of a wolf. But there is a strange power in this deprivation. Because you have no heavy baggage, no cooking fires, and no waste, you are truly untraceable. The British Scouts look for the signs of life: the ash of a fire, the bones of a goat, the discarded tin. They find nothing where you have been. You are a ghost who leaves no crumbs. You once heard a joke about that crocodile dung sunscreen. The British think you use it because they couldn't imagine anyone surviving this sun without help. You just use the dirt. It's free, it's everywhere, and it smells like the mountain. As you settle into your nest for the evening, you pull out a piece of the naan you baked 3 weeks ago. It is so hard you have to soak it in your mouth for several minutes before you can even bite into it. It tastes of smoke and dust, but to you, it tastes like survival. You watch the British camp below, seeing the flickering light of their large communal fires and smelling the rich, heavy scent of their stew. That smell is a tactical error. It tells you exactly where they are, how many of them are eating, and how comfortable they feel. You, meanwhile, remain a shadow fueled by a handful of berries and a singular, cold purpose. The sniper's diet also serves a psychological function. It separates you from the world of the living. When you haven't tasted fresh meat or warm bread for a month, you start to feel like a part of the geology. You become as patient as the stones and as indifferent as the wind. This detachment is what allows you to wait 3 days for a single target without moving. You aren't a man waiting for a meal. You are a force of nature, waiting for an opportunity. You take one last mulberry, the sweetness a sharp contrast to the bitter almond still on your tongue, and prepare for the night. The British are full and sleepy. You are hungry and awake. And in the mountains, the hungry man always has the advantage. As the stars begin to sharpen in the thin air, you feel the familiar hum of energy that comes from a clean, empty system. You check your jazil, the wood smooth against your calloused hands. Your body is a finely tuned instrument of war, unburdened by the luxuries of civilization. Tomorrow, you will move to the high pass near the border, a 3-day trek that will cost you nothing but a few more handfuls of berries. The British will need a whole column of mules to make the same journey. You smile in the dark, a lean, predatory expression. They have the empire, but you have the endurance. The British soldiers have a word for what you've become: the hill ghost. It's a name born not of respect, but of a creeping, corrosive dread that has begun to unravel the morale of the local garrison. You've noticed the change from your Overwatch. The men no longer lounge by the stream during their downtime. They move in frantic hunched dashes, their eyes constantly flicking toward the ridges with a 1,000-yard stare. It is a mainstream historical fact that the sniping habit of the frontier tribes caused more psychological trauma to British troops than the actual casualties inflicted. A single well-placed shot every 48 hours is more effective at breaking a unit's spirit than a massed assault, because an assault is a problem you can fight, whereas a ghost is a problem you can only fear. You probably wouldn't survive the mental toll of this isolation if you didn't understand the psychology of the invisible foe. You aren't just trying to kill individuals, you are trying to kill the British sense of certainty. They rely on the idea that the world is a predictable place governed by the Queen's regulations. By striking at random intervals from impossible distances, you introduce the poison of the unknown. You watch a sentry drop his tobacco pipe because a bird flapped its wings too loudly nearby. That's your victory. You've turned the entire landscape into a weapon. Every rock is a potential muzzle, and every gust of wind is a potential bullet. One quirky fringe tidbit about the psychology of the frontier is that the British started painting lucky symbols on their sangar walls, or carrying odd talismans like rabbit feet and specific silver coins to ward off the mountain's sting. You've even heard of a sergeant who refused to wear his cap, convinced that the ghost only targeted men with headgear. You find this amusing, so you play along. You spend an entire morning watching a group of soldiers, and you intentionally shoot the canteen off the belt of the most superstitious-looking man in the bunch. You don't hurt him, you just let the water drain into the dust. Now, he's convinced his luck has run out, and his fear will spread through the barracks like a fever. Historians still argue whether the British High Command ever truly understood the depth of the psychological warfare being waged against them. Some suggest they dismissed it as native treachery, while others believe they were fully aware that their men were on the brink of a collective nervous breakdown. From your perspective, the answer is in the way they've started firing their cannons at nothing. You hear the boom of a mountain gun every hour on the hour, shells exploding harmlessly against the granite peaks. They aren't aiming at you, they're trying to convince themselves that they are still the masters of the noise. It's a pathetic display of power that only confirms their desperation. You recall a fringe detail about a British captain who tried to use music therapy, ordering the regimental band to play upbeat marches in the middle of a siege to keep the men's spirits up. You let them play for 20 minutes, enjoying the strange, tinny sound of the brass instruments in the canyon, before you put a lead ball through the center of the big bass drum. The beoing of the drum skin tearing was the last note they played that week. The silence that followed was heavier than any cannon fire. You aren't just a sniper. You are a surgeon of the mind, and you know exactly where to cut to make the courage bleed out. The invisible foe strategy is most effective when it's combined with a blood feud cover. Because the British can't find a single unified enemy to blame, their frustration turns inward. They start to blame each other, their guides, and the unreliable local scouts. You've watched officers argue in the middle of the camp, their faces red with the strain of leadership under an invisible threat. You probably wouldn't survive the shame of being a common murderer, but you view this as a holy work of liberation. Every man who decides he has had enough and deserts the Raj is one less man you have to shoot. You are facilitating a mass exodus of the spirit. As the sun begins to set, casting long skeletal shadows across the garrison, you see the night picket being formed. The men look like they are heading to their own funerals. They move with a funereal slowness, their shoulders slumped under the weight of their rifles. You decide to give them a night of peace. You won't fire a single shot. Sometimes, the silence is more terrifying than the noise. They will spend 12 hours staring into the darkness, their hearts racing at every cricket's chirp, waiting for a shot that never comes. By dawn, they will be more exhausted than if they had fought a pitched battle. You pack your gear, the smell of the mountain sagebrush filling your lungs. You are the hidden story that keeps the British generals awake in their mahogany-paneled offices. They can map the mountains and build the forts, but they cannot occupy the minds of their own men as long as you are out here. You take one last look at the flickering lights of the camp, a small, dark smile touching your lips. Tomorrow, they will send out a patrol to find you, and tomorrow, you will be 10 miles away, watching a different gate. The psychology of the invisible foe is simple. If they can't see you, they can't stop you. And if they can't stop you, they've already lost. To understand the true resilience of the frontier, you have to look past the rifle and into the hidden forge. Deep in a limestone cavern that smells of sulfur, charcoal, and the ancient breath of the earth, you are hunched over a small, intense fire fed by goat dung bellows. This is where your war is really sustained. It is a mainstream historical fact that the tribal areas, particularly around the Kohat Pass, became world famous for their clandestine armories, where local smiths used nothing but hand tools and a remarkable eye for metallurgy to copy the most advanced British weapons. But for your campaign, you don't want a perfect copy. You want an untraceable one. You are currently melting down a collection of scavenged, lead-old British mini-balls, a broken plumbing pipe from a colonial bungalow, and even the tiny weights from a fisherman's net. You probably wouldn't survive the toxic fumes of this workspace if you had unlearned the ventilation secrets of the cave, knowing exactly when the mountain breeze will suck the smoke through a hidden chimney in the ceiling. You are casting ghost lead. By mixing different sources of metal, you create a chemical signature that defies British forensic logic. If they analyze a bullet pulled from a captain's shoulder, they'll find a mix of metals that doesn't correspond to any known military supply chain. This is the ultimate untraceable ammunition. You pour the molten silver-gray liquid into a soapstone mold, the heat radiating against your face until your skin feels tight and scorched. One quirky fringe tidbit about these hidden forges is that the smith would often use human hair or goat fleece as a binding agent when tempering the iron for new barrels, believing it added a spiritual strength to the metal. You are more pragmatic. You use the quench method taught by your grandfather, plunging the hot lead into a vat of fermented pomegranate juice. You've heard historians still argue whether the local gunpowder was actually superior to the British pebble powder of the 1880s. You know, it isn't better in a lab, but it's faster in the sense that it ignites at a lower temperature, giving your jazile a slightly quicker lock time, a fraction of a second. That often means the difference between a hit and a miss. The forge is a place of absolute secrecy. If the British political agents found this cave, they would blow it with dynamite, as they did to hundreds of tribal workshops during the 1897 campaign. But you've hidden the entrance behind a shifting rock face that requires a specific sequence of pushes to open. You recall a fringe detail about a British officer who spent 2 years trying to find a legendary underground rifle factory in the Khyber, only to realize he had walked over it every single day on his way to his office. The mountain doesn't just hide men, it hides the means of their resistance. As you work the lead with a small, hand-filed rasp, smoothing out the seams of the mold, you think about the life cycle of this metal. It began in a factory in England, was shipped across the oceans, carried by a mule, up the pass fired by a soldier at a shadow, and then recovered by you from the mud to be melted down and fired back. It's a violent, beautiful recycling program. You are literally turning the empire's own weight against itself. You've even learned to stamp your lead with a fake tribal mark, a small, stylized crescent, to ensure that if a bullet is ever recovered, it points the finger toward a southern clan you want the British to investigate. The physical toll of the forge is different from the crawl. Your back is cramped from the low ceiling, and your eyes are bloodshot from the flickering light and the stinging smoke. But there is a deep, artisanal satisfaction in this work. You aren't just a consumer of war, you are a producer. You know exactly how many strikes are left in your pouch. You check the weight of a finished ball in your palm. It's heavy, balanced, and cold. This is the hidden forge where the history's hidden stories are truly forged in the dark, in the heat, and in the refusal to be outproduced by an industrial superpower. You remember that crocodile dung joke: the British would rather believe you found your weapons in a magical cave than admit you have the technical skill to manufacture them. They see your tools and see primitiveness. You see your tools and see independence. You take a final batch of lead balls and wrap them in a piece of oil-soaked linen. They are ready. You extinguish the forge with a handful of damp sand, the hiss of the steam the only sound in the cavern. The darkness returns, thick and absolute. As you exit the cave, the cool mountain air feels like a blessing on your overheated skin. You carry with you a new supply of ghost lead, enough for another month of strategic assassinations. The British think they've cut off the supply lines to the tribes by blockading the passes, but they can't blockade the earth itself. You are standing on a mountain of iron and lead, and as long as you have a fire and a mold, the hill ghost will never run out of teeth. You begin the climb back to your overwatch. The heavy pouch of lead, a reassuring weight against your hip, a silent promise of the shots yet to come. The art of the false flag is a delicate dance of deception that requires you to be as much a storyteller as a marksman. You are currently perched on a ridge, overlooking a narrow junction where two different tribal territories meet: the lands of the Moments and the Utman Kel. Below you, a British dispatch rider is galloping toward the regional headquarters, carrying orders that could shift the entire winter strategy of the Raj. You aren't going to kill him, you're going to brand him. It is a mainstream historical fact that the British military frequently relied on tribal experts to identify the culprits of attacks, based on the type of weapon used, the style of the wound, or the specific artifacts left at the scene. You have spent months studying these experts, so you can feed them a lie they are desperate to believe. You probably wouldn't survive the blowback of your actions if you didn't have a perfect villain to cast in your place. Today, that villain is the head of the Moment clan. A man who famously insulted your uncle's lineage at a wedding feast 10 years ago. To frame him, you have prepared a very specific calling card. You've acquired a handful of distinctive square-cut brass tacks, the kind the Moment smiths use to decorate their rifle stocks in a unique star pattern. You've also spent the morning practicing with a captured Moment-style knife, learning to mimic the specific, shallow flesh fret cut they use to mark their territory. This is the false flags and family names phase of your campaign, where you use the British as your personal executioners to settle ancient scores. One quirky fringe tidbit about these deceptions is that some snipers would actually swap their shoes for the distinctively woven sandals of a rival tribe before approaching a scene, knowing the British scouts were obsessed with tracking footprints in the dust. You have a pair of these sandals tied to your pack. After you disable the dispatch rider's horse with a precise shot to the leg, you will descend, plant the brass tacks, leave a dropped Moment tobacco tin, and then retreat. Historians still argue whether the extreme instability of the frontier was inherent or if it was exacerbated by such internal manipulations. From your perspective, you are simply using the tools available to ensure that when the British strike back, they strike the people you want out of the way. The shot is easy, a low-velocity thud that drops the horse without killing the rider. As the soldier scrambles to his feet, dazed and terrified, he catches a glimpse of a figure in a Moment-style turban disappearing into the rocks. You make sure he sees enough to be a witness, but not enough to be a threat. You drop the evidence with the practiced ease of a stage magician. This isn't just a hit, it's a narrative. Tomorrow, the British District Commissioner will receive a report that the Moments have broken the peace treaty. The blood feud cover will be reinforced, and the British will focus their punitive expedition on your rivals, leaving your own village in peace to harvest its crops. You recall a fringe detail about a British officer who tried to create a bullet library, a collection of lead balls from every known tribe to help identify shooters. You find it hilarious. You've been casting your bullets in 3 different molds for months, rotating them like a deck of cards. One day you are an Afridi, the next you are a Shnwari. You are a man of 1,000 family names, and yet you have none. This layer of false flags makes you untouchable. The British are looking for a rebel leader, but they keep finding tribal squabbles. They are looking for a political movement, but they keep finding family vengeance. They are blinded by their own categories. The psychology of the false flag is that it exploits the British desire for local justice. They want to believe that the frontier is a place of petty, irrational men who care more about a stolen goat than an empire. By giving them proof of that pettiness, you keep them from looking for the strategic mastermind. You probably wouldn't survive the moral weight of this if you did unsee the British as an existential threat to your entire way of life. By turning them against the most aggressive and pro-Aura clans, you are actually thinning out the ranks of the people who would lead your tribe into a suicidal, full-scale battle. You are a shepherd, culling the wolves by leading the hunters to their dens. As the sun sets, you watch from a safe distance as a British patrol reaches the downed rider. They find the brass tacks, they find the tobacco tin, they see the Moment footprints. You can almost hear the gears of the colonial bureaucracy grinding into action. By dawn, the Moment towers will be in the sights of the British mountain guns. You feel a cold, detached satisfaction. You've protected your home, settled a debt of honor, and weakened the British hold on the pass, all without revealing a single truth about yourself. You are the shadow that writes the history books in the blood of its enemies. You pack your gear, switching back to your own sandals for the long climb home. The false flag has been flown, and the wind is blowing it exactly where you intended. The British think they are pacifying the frontier by punishing the Moments. They don't realize they are just being used as a blunt instrument in a much older, much more complex game. You take one last look at the valley, where the first British signal flares are beginning to go up the all-call for a retaliatory strike. The play is in motion. You disappear into the darkness, a ghost who has just directed a masterpiece of colonial tragedy. The sky above the Malakand Ridge has turned an eerie, bruised copper, the stars winking out as the moon begins to slide into the Earth's shadow. Tonight is a lunar eclipse, a celestial event that the local mullahs have whispered is a sign of divine displeasure. But for you, it is a tactical window of absolute velvet darkness. The British camp below has fallen into a state of nervous high alert. They've heard the rumors of night gowls and spirit wires, and the fading light only fuels their colonial superstitions. You are currently bailey crawling through a field of razor-sharp shale toward the very heart of their fortified camp. This is the night of the long shadows, an infiltration mission so daring it would be considered suicide by anyone who has spent 20 years learning to breathe in rhythm with the mountain. It is a mainstream historical fact that the British military of the late 19th century was technologically superior in almost every way. Yet they remained deeply vulnerable to night. They had the Maxim guns and the Martini Henrys, but they didn't have the night vision of a man who grew up without lamps. You probably wouldn't survive the perimeter searchlights if this were a modern conflict, but tonight, the searchlights are just flickering oil lanterns and dying campfires. As the eclipse reaches its totality, the world is bathed in a dim, ghostly red light, the blood moon. You use this moment to slip past the outer picket, moving between the sentries like a drift of smoke. You aren't here to fire your Jazeel. The long barrel is strapped to your back, wrapped in dark wool to prevent any clink against the stones. Tonight, your weapon is a thin, blackened blade and a handful of forged documents. One quirky fringe tidbit about these night infiltrations is that some tribal scouts would rub their bodies with rendered animal, fat and soot, to mask their scent from the British guard dogs. You've gone a step further. You've spent the last hour lying in a goat pen to ensure you smell like the most common, unremarkable thing in the valley. Historians still argue whether these individual acts of infiltration were part of a coordinated, intelligence-auguring effort or merely bravado runs. For you, this is a surgical strike on the British paper wall. You've identified the tent of the Quartermaster General, the man who holds the ledgers, detailing the locations of every hidden grain depot. The British have seized from the local villages. If you can recover or destroy those ledgers, the winter famine that the British are using as a weapon will be broken. You reach the canvas wall of the main tent. Inside, you can hear the low, rhythmic snoring of a man who believes he is safe behind 3 circles of armed guards. You don't use the door. You use a small, razor-sharp slit at the base of the rear flap. You slide inside, the air smelling of stale tobacco, ink, and lavender-scented soap, the smell of an empire that tries too hard to be clean. You find the ledger on a folding mahogany desk. But you don't just take it. You recall the false flag tactics from the Southern Pass. You replace the ledger with a forgery. You've spent 3 nights creating a book that contains corrected locations that will lead the British search parties directly into a series of narrow dead-end canyons where your kinsmen are waiting with boulders and matchlocks. You remember that crocodile dung joke: the British think you are too primitive to understand the value of a supply line or a written record. They don't realize that your literacy is a weapon. You slide back out of the tent just as the moon begins to emerge from the shadow. The first sliver of silver light hitting the peaks. The timing is perfect. The sentries are rubbing their eyes, their vision adjusting to the return of the light, creating a blind spot that lasts for several minutes. You move through the shadows of the supply wagons, feeling the cool weight of the stolen ledger against your chest. You've just executed a daring theft under the cover of a celestial event. And the British, don't even know they've been robbed until they try to follow your map tomorrow. The psychology of the night walk is intense. Every heartbeat feels like a drum, and every rustle of the wind feels like a shouted challenge. But you find a cold, sharp clarity in the danger. You are the hidden story in its purest form, a man who entered the lion's den, touched the lion's mane, and walked out without a scratch. You probably wouldn't survive the adrenaline crash if you didn't have a 3-mile climb ahead of you to burn off the tension. You reach the outer perimeter, sliding over a low stone wall and into the safety of the dark nullah. Behind you, the British camp is waking up, the bugles sounding the morning call. completely unaware that their strategic advantage has just been replaced by a death warrant written in their own ink. Historians still argue whether the failure of the 1897 grain blockade was due to administrative incompetence or tribal cunning. You know, the truth is simpler. The British forgot that the people they were trying to starve were the same people who knew every inch of the earth they were standing on. You reach your high cave as the sun begins to crest the horizon, turning the red moon into a memory. You unwrap the ledger, looking at the lists of names and numbers. To the British, these are just statistics. To you, these are the lives of your children and the survival of your valley. You've turned a lunar eclipse into a tactical masterclass. As you begin the slow process of decoding the British notes, you feel a sense of grim satisfaction. The night of the long shadows has ended, but the consequences will be felt for months. The British will march into those canyons tomorrow, confident in their stolen information, only to find the mountain itself closing in on them. You take a bite of a dried mulberry, the sweetness sharp and rewarding, and prepare for the final phase of your campaign. The shadows are long, but your memory is longer. As you sit by a tiny, smokeless fire high in the Safeco, you listen to the low murmur of two travelers resting in the cave below. They don't know you're there, no one ever does, but they are talking about you. They speak of a giant who carries a rifle made of dragon bone, a spirit who can turn into a puff of gray smoke when a British bullet gets too close, and a sorcerer who can command the mountain winds to carry his lead balls around corners. This is the legend grows phase of your journey, where the reality of your grueling, dusty life is being swallowed by the colorful leviathan of folklore. It is a mainstream historical fact that the Pashtun warriors were romanticized and mythologized by the very British writers who fought them, creating a literary image of a noble savage that often bore little resemblance to the desperate tactical reality of the frontier. You probably wouldn't survive the ego trip of this fame if you didn't know how much of it is dangerous nonsense. The travelers believe you don't eat or sleep. You know that your joints ache from the damp and your stomach is currently cramping from a bad batch of dried mutton. But you realize that this folklore is a tactical asset. If the British soldiers believe they are fighting a ghost, they will fire their rifles with trembling hands. If they believe you are a sorcerer, they will look for magic instead of looking for the very real, very human tripod marks you left in the dirt. You are the hidden story that is being edited in real time by the imaginations of 1,000 campfires. One quirky fringe tidbit about this folklore is the legend of the silver bullet. Some locals claim that you only use bullets cast from stolen British medals of valor, and that these bullets never miss because they crave the hearts of the men they were taken from. In reality, you use lead you melted in a goat dung fire, but you don't correct the story. You've even encouraged it by occasionally leaving a polished, shiny bullet on a prominent rock near a British outpost. Historians still argue whether the supernatural reputation of the frontier snipers was a psychological defense mechanism used by the British to explain away their humiliating losses to primitive tribes. To you, the reason doesn't matter. The result is a perimeter of fear that keeps the enemy pinned behind their walls. You recall a fringe detail about a British officer who became so obsessed with your myth that he started leaving letters for you under a specific cairn of stones, challenging the ghost of the peaks to a fair duel. He thought he was in a romantic novel. You thought he was a security risk. You didn't answer the letters with words. You answered by stealing his horse's saddle in the middle of the night and leaving it on top of the fort's flagpole. The legend grew. The ghost can walk through walls. The reality, you found a drainage pipe the British forgot to grate. By feeding the folklore, you ensure the British focus on the impossible feats while you continue to perform the very possible, very lethal ones. The divide between folklore and reality is where you live. While the poets sing of your eagle eyes, you are actually struggling with a bit of grit that has been bothering your left eye for 2 days. While they talk of your rifle of dragon bone, you are currently binding a crack in your walnut stalk with a piece of wet rawhide. This is the unglamorous truth of the strategic assassin. It is 10% shooting and 90% maintenance, patience, and surviving the elements. You probably wouldn't survive the reality of your life if you did and have the legend to wrap around you like a second Pashtu. Keeping the cold world of the British administration at bay, you listen as one traveler tells the other that the ghost once took out an entire British mountain battery by whistling a tune that made the mules stampede. You chuckle silently. You didn't whistle, you threw a hornet's nest into the mule lines. But the whistling story is better. It makes you sound like a force of nature rather than a man who is willing to get stung by hornets for a tactical advantage. The more the folklore grows, the more invisible the real you becomes. You are disappearing behind a wall of tall tales, which is exactly where a sniper needs to be. As the travelers pack their bags to leave, one of them looks up at the dark ridges and shivers. "He's watching us now," he whispers. You are, but not because you are a spirit, because you need to make sure they do unaccidentally wander into the path of the British patrol you've been tracking. You watch them go, feeling the weight of the stories they carry. You are a man who has been turned into a ghost by the needs of his people and the fears of his enemies. You take a slow breath of the thin, cold air, feeling the reality of the stone against your back. The legend is for the valley. The reality is for the heights. The sun begins to touch the peaks, turning the dragon bone of your rifle into simple, worn wood. The folklore of the night fades into the tactical demands of the day. You check your powder, you check your lead, and you check the wind. The British are moving a new telegraph team into the lower pass, and they are bringing a legend hunter with them, officer who claims he can see through the smoke and the stories. You settle into your position, the hill ghost once again becoming a man of flesh and lead, ready to write the next chapter of a story that no one will ever truly know. The air at 10,000 feet is so thin it feels like a physical vacuum, pulling the heat from your body even as the midday sun beats down on the jagged limestone. You are lying in your final overwatch, a position so precarious it requires you to be lashed to a gnarled juniper root with a length of braided goteer rope. Below you, the final piece of the British winter offensive is falling into place. A massive bridge project over the Panjkora River that would allow heavy artillery to reach the heart of the tribal highlands. This is the final overwatch, the moment where your Decadellon campaign of whispers and lead meets a moral crossroads that your ancestors never had to navigate. You aren't just looking at a target, you are looking at the future of the mountain. It is a mainstream historical fact that the British forward policy relied on these engineering feats bridges, roads, and telegraphs to break the back of tribal resistance by making the impenetrable heights accessible to the industrial might of the Raj. You probably wouldn't survive the heartbreak of seeing your valley paved over if you didn't have the power to stop it with a single, impossible shot. But there is a complication. The lead engineer on the bridge is not a British officer. He is a local man, a brilliance born of your own soil, who took the British silver to learn their math and their steel. If you kill him, you settle the strategic debt, but you murder the only person who can build the irrigation systems your people need to survive the coming drought. One quirky or fringe tidbit about these frontier dilemmas is the concept of nanawatai, the right of a person to seek asylum even from their greatest enemy. The engineer has sent word to the Jirga that he is working for the British, only to learn the secrets of the iron so he can bring water to the thirsty southern plains. Historians still argue whether these collaborators were true traitors or the first wave of modernists trying to save their culture from within. You are the judge, the jury, and the executioner, balanced on a shelf of rock with a hand-cast lead ball in the chamber. You have to decide if honor is found in the destruction of the bridge or the preservation of the man who understands its architecture. You recall a fringe detail about a sniper in the Tira campaign who chose to shoot the tools instead of the hands destroying the specific. Imported German surveying lenses to stop a road without killing the local workers. You look through your sights, not at the engineer's heart, but at the main tension cable of the suspension bridge. It is a thick, braided wire under immense stress. If you can hit the anchor pin where it meets the rock, the entire structure will collapse under its own weight, rendering months of British labor useless without spilling the blood of a kinsman. This is the decision of honor. It is a shot of nearly 900 yards through a cross-canyon draft that is currently gusting at 20 miles per hour. The psychology of this moment is different from the cold professional curiosity of your earlier kills. Your hands are steady, but your mind is a storm of competing obligations. Pashtunwali demands you protect the land, but it also demands you respect the potential of your people. You take a slow, agonizingly deep breath, feeling the juniper root bite into your waist. You adjust the heavy iron barrel of the Jazal, accounting for the lift. The warm air from the river gorge will give the bullet. You aren't just a sniper now, you are a philosopher with a trigger. You decide that the bridge must fall, but the man must live to build something better. The recoil of the Jazal is a deafening roar in the silence of the high peaks. the white smoke instantly shredded by the canyon wind. You watch as the heavy lead bowyer ghost led from the hidden forge strikes the iron anchor pin, with a spark that is visible even from this distance. For a heartbeat, nothing happens. Then, the sound reaches you, a high-pitched metallic ping followed by the tectonic groan of shifting steel. The bridge doesn't just fall, it uncoils like a dying snake, the timber planks fluttering into the river like playing cards. The workers scramble back to the safety of the banks, the local engineer standing frozen, looking up at the ridges with an expression of profound understanding. You don't wait to see if they find the moment brass tacks you left nearby as a final redirection. You are already undoing the rope, your fingers numb but sure. You've just cost the British Empire £10,000 and 6 months of strategic momentum, and you did it without adding a single name to the blood debt ledger. You probably wouldn't survive the satisfaction of this moment if you stayed to gloat. You slide into the shadows of the peak, the final overwatch complete. You've protected the mountain, and in doing so, you've protected the possibility of a world where the mountain might one day choose its own path. As you begin the descent toward the northern border, you feel the weight of the decade lifting. The legend of the hill ghost will only grow from this. The ghost, who destroyed a bridge of iron with a single shot. The British will call it a structural failure in their official reports to save face, but the soldiers will whisper the truth around their fires. You find a high, hidden path that leads away from the conflict, toward the quiet glaciers of the inner range. Your campaign is over. The hidden story has reached its final punctuation mark. Written in the dust of a fallen bridge and the silence of a man who chose life over revenge, the era of the great game is tilting toward its sunset, and the jagged skyline of the Hindu Kush remains as defiant as the day you first drew breath in its shadow. Down in the valleys, the British are packing their heavy crates, their forward policy blunted by the sheer, grinding reality of the frontier and the rising tremors of a world preparing for a much larger war in the West. You are standing on the very edge of the world, watching the long shadows of the peaks stretch out to meet the plains of India. It is a mainstream historical fact that by the early 20th century, the British began to withdraw from many of their more exposed frontier outposts, opting for a policy of close border defense because the cost in blood and silver had simply become unsustainable. You know, in the marrow of your bones, that you are the reason that ledger didn't balance. You probably wouldn't survive the transition to a peaceful life if you had already become more stone than man. Your Jazeel, once a bright instrument of brass and polished wood, is now weathered and gray, its barrel pitted by the grit of 1,000 storms and its stock scarred by the vertical miles you've traveled. You are the hidden story that the official histories will never quite capture the individual who used the ancient rhythms of the blood feud to mask a modern strategic campaign of resistance. Historians still argue whether the frontier was ever truly conquered, or if the British simply grew tired of shouting into the wind. From your vantage point, the answer is clear. The mountain never belongs to the one who builds the road. It belongs to the one who knows where the road ends. One quirky fringe tidbit about the end of this era is that some British officers, upon leaving their posts, left behind gifts of ammunition and rifles for the very snipers who had haunted them, a final begrudging salute to a worthy foe. You found such a gift 3 days ago, a crate of high-quality cartridges and a note in English that you could read, but whose respect you could feel in the weight of the wood. You didn't keep the rifles, you buried them. The War of the Hill Ghost is not a war for trophies. It is a war for the silence that is now returning to the high passes. You are fading back into the landscape, your footsteps leaving no more mark on history than the shadow of a passing hawk. The hidden forge has been cold for months, and the false flags have all been flown. You look down at your hands, seeing the permanent stains of lead and charcoal, a map of a decade spent in the service of a ghost. You've settled the debts of your family, protected the water of your village, and turned an empire's own weight against itself. You recall that crocodile dung joke one last time and smile. The British are leaving with their myths intact, still convinced they were defeated by a savage mystery rather than a calculated mind. Let them keep their stories. The truth is held in the stillness of the rocks and the longevity of the code. As the last light of the sun catches the snow on the distant peaks of the Pamirs, you feel the mountain retaining its secrets, and you are among the greatest of them. You unstring your goatear rope, holster your blackened blade, and take one final look at the valley where the British fires are flickering out for the last time. The century is turning, and the world below is changing, but up here, the wind still speaks the same language it did when the first Pashtun stepped onto the shale. You turn your back on the road, on the bridges, and on the empire, and begin the long, quiet walk into the heart of the range where the maps have no lines. And now, as the image of those red-inked peaks begins to soften and blur in your mind, let the weight of the journey fall away. The high, thin air of the frontier is replaced by the warmth and safety of the present, and the sharp crack of the Jezil is nothing more than a fading echo in a dream you about to have. The mountains are vast, but they are still, and that stillness is wrapping around you now like the heavy wool of a patu, shielding you from the noise of the world. You are safe, you are distant from the fray, and the stories of the past are tucked away in the shadows where they belong. Feel the steady rhythm of your own breath, a calm counterpoint to the mountain wind, as the jagged edges of the history we've walked through begin to smooth into a soft velvet dark. The ghosts of the past have found their peace, and the ridges are silent at last. The fire has burned down to embers, the stars are watching over the quiet earth, and there is nothing left to do but drift.